When Troy fell, one man walked out of the burning city carrying his father on his shoulders, not running, walking. Because a man carrying his elderly father through the ruins of everything he had ever known could not run. He could only move forward one step at a time through the smoke and the screaming and the orange light of a civilization dying around him, with his small son's hand gripping his own in the dark. His name was Aeneas. He was a Trojan prince and a son of the goddess Venus. And on the night Troy fell, he lost everything except the two things he could carry, and the one destiny he could not escape. Tonight we are going to follow him across the Mediterranean Sea, through storms that gods sent specifically to drown him, through a love story so complete and so devastating that it has been called one of the greatest tragedies in all of literature, through the darkness of the underworld itself, and finally to a hillside in Italy, where he will put down his father's bones and begin the work of building the civilization that will one day become Rome. This is the Aeneid, Virgil's epic poem. If you are listening to this right now, I need you to do one thing before we go any further. Open the comments section. Type where you are in the world tonight, your city, your state if you are in the United States, your country if you are outside it. Just that, one location. We are building a live map of where in the world people listen to these stories, and every single comment adds to it, and we read every single one. There is something remarkable about knowing that people in Texas and California and New York and London and Australia and India and wherever you are tonight are all in the dark together listening to the same 3,000-year-old story. You are part of that. Tell us where you are. And while you are in the comments, subscribe if you have not already subscribed. The notification bell too. It costs you nothing, and it means we can keep making these stories. Written 2,000 years ago, commissioned by the Emperor Augustus to tell the story of where Rome came from and what it was made of. It has been read continuously since the day it was written. School children in Rome memorized it, the way school children in later centuries would memorize Shakespeare. Every educated person in Western history for the last 2,000 years has known this story. And tonight, in the comfortable dark of wherever you are, we are going to walk through it together from the first line to the last. Before we begin, I need you to do something for me. Drop a comment below right now, before you fall asleep, and tell me two things. First, where in the world you are watching from tonight, your city, your country, whatever you want to share. Second, type either Q&A or news to me, depending on whether you already knew that the founders of Rome were Trojan refugees. I read every single comment, and I genuinely want to know how many people come to this video already knowing this extraordinary fact. The comments section is where this community lives, and I want to hear from you. Also, if this video carries you somewhere tonight, if it gives you the long, quiet journey you were looking for, please like it before you fall asleep. That single action tells YouTube that this story is worth sharing, and it is. It is 3,000 years old, and it has never stopped being worth sharing. Now, let us begin. The night Troy fell, Aeneas was at home with his family. This is the detail that the epic begins with, and it is the detail that matters most. He was not on the walls. He was not on the beach fighting for a last stand. He was at home, in the house where he lived with his father Anchises and his young son Ascanius. And he was asleep when the Greek soldiers poured through the gates that the wooden horse had opened from within. What woke him was the ghost of Hector came to him in the dream the way the dead come in ancient stories, not as the warrior who had led Troy's armies for 10 years, but as what the war had made him at the end, pale and disfigured, still carrying the wounds from the chariot's dragging, his beard clotted with dried blood. He came to Aeneas's bedside, and he looked at his cousin with the particular expression of someone who has already passed through the worst, and is trying to prepare someone else for it. "Get up," Hector said. "Troy is falling. There is nothing you can do about it. Take the household gods, the sacred objects that carry the divine protection of your family line, and carry them away from this place. You are the one who will carry them. Not me, not anyone else. You. The city will build itself again someday, but not here, and not by me. Take the gods, find new walls for them and somewhere else in the world. Go. And then Aeneas woke up. The sounds that reached him from outside were the sounds of a city discovering it had already lost. The Greek army was inside the walls. The Trojans, who had fallen asleep, celebrating what they believed was the end of the siege, were fighting in their own streets with whatever they could find. The fire was already spreading from the areas nearest the gates. The orange light, visible through every window, was not dawn. Aeneas grabbed his weapons and made for the roof to see the full scope of what was happening. What he saw from the rooftop of his house on that last night of Troy was something that no amount of 10 years of war could have fully prepared him for. The city was not being defeated in the ordinary sense. It was being consumed. The Greek army was everywhere simultaneously, moving through streets that the Trojans had built and known for generations, and that the Greeks had been studying from a distance for a decade. They knew where to go. They moved with the terrible efficiency of men who have been planning this for 10 years and are finally executing the plan. Aeneas did what warriors do when they are confronted with a situation that is already lost. He went toward the fighting. He gathered the men who were near him, and he went toward the walls and the gates, and he fought in the streets of Troy, for as long as fighting in the streets of Troy meant anything, which was not long. He watched men he knew die. He watched buildings he had walked past every day of his life catch fire. He watched the palace of Priam, the great palace at the centre of the city, become a place where old men died at altars they had prayed at their whole lives. He was not afraid. He was something past fear. He was in the particular state that extreme situations sometimes produce in people who have trained for exactly this: a cold, clear attention to the immediate and the possible, a narrowing of everything to the next action and the next moment, without any room for the larger understanding of what was happening to break through and overwhelm the functioning. Then he saw his mother. Venus appeared to him on the walls of Troy on its last night, and she looked at him with the expression that divine parents wear when they are watching a beloved child make a mistake that will cost them everything if not corrected immediately. She was not there to fight beside him. She was there to make him see. She showed him what was actually happening. The gods were pulling Troy down. Not the Greeks. The gods, Juno, who had hated Troy since the judgment of Paris, was standing over the city, directing the destruction from the divine plane that mortals cannot see without divine assistance. Neptune was tearing the foundations apart. Athena, who had favoured the Greeks throughout the war, was unleashing divine force against the walls from outside. Jupiter himself, the king of the gods, his own grandfather through Venus, had turned his face away from Troy's prayers. This was not a battle that more fighting could affect. This was a decision that had been made at a level above human choice. The city that the gods had once helped build, they were now choosing to unmake, and the people inside it were not fighting against Greek soldiers. They were caught in a divine will that had concluded Troy's time was over. And Aeneas, with divine sight temporarily given to him by his mother on the walls of the burning city, understood what he could not have understood without it. There was one thing left to do: not fighting, not dying on the walls in a final stand that would be remembered but would change nothing. Something harder and more demanding than either of those things: survive and carry what could be saved. He ran home. His father, Anchises, was an old man who had once been loved by a goddess. Venus had come to him when he was young and beautiful on the slopes of Mount Ida, the same mountain where Paris had made his famous judgment. Their union had produced Aeneas, and then Venus had left, as divine beings always leave, taking with her the particular intensity of divine love, and leaving behind the ordinary human life that continued without it. Anchises was old now, and his legs were weak from an injury that old stories attributed to Jupiter's thunderbolt, a punishment for boasting about Venus's affection. He lived in the house with his son and his grandson, and he had been sleeping through the fall of Troy, the way the elderly sometimes sleep through catastrophes, somewhere in a space beyond ordinary wakefulness. Aeneas shook him awake and told him what was happening. Anchises refused to come. This is one of the moments in the Aeneid that has made readers stop and think for 2,000 years, because Anchises' refusal was not cowardice and it was not confused. It was the particular decision of an old man who has lived through enough and who sees in the catastrophe around him not a tragedy to be survived, but a conclusion that he is in some sense ready for. He told Aeneas to go. He told him to take Ascanius and leave. He said he was too old to be useful, and that the gods had already shown by their destruction of Troy that his generation's time was finished. He said he wanted to die in Troy. Aeneas stood in his father's room, with the fire visible through every window, and the sounds of the Greek army moving closer through the streets, and he refused. He told his father he was not leaving without him. He said it with the particular quiet of someone who has made a decision that is not negotiable, and that they know is not negotiable. The divine sign that changed Anchises' mind was small. A flame appeared above the head of little Ascanius, standing in the doorway watching his grandfather and his father negotiate the terms of the family's survival. Not a flame that burned, a light. A gentle illumination that sat on the child's head like a crown, and that both men recognized immediately as divine attention, as a marker placed on a child by a god who had already decided that this particular child mattered to the future of the world. Anchises looked at the light above his grandson's head, and he changed his mind. He told Aeneas to carry him. He could not walk well enough to keep pace. Aeneas would have to carry him. And so the image that defines the beginning of the Aeneid was assembled in a burning room in a burning city on the last night of the world that had been. Aeneas in his armour, his father Anchises on his shoulders, holding in his own arms the small sacred objects, the household gods, the carved figures that represented the divine protection of the family line, his son Ascanius, small enough to require his hand but old enough to run if his hand was held, and behind them the flames. He told his wife Creusa to follow behind them. He told her to stay close, that he would be able to move faster if she stayed just behind him, so he could focus on his father and son without dividing his attention. He believed she heard him. He believed she understood. They moved through Troy. The route Aeneas chose through the burning city is described in the Aeneid with the specificity of someone who had walked it many times under different circumstances. He knew which streets would be clear and which would be blocked. He knew which areas the fire had reached and which were still passable. He moved through his own city for the last time, the way you move through a place you have known your whole life when it is ending, with the muscle memory of 1,000 ordinary journeys overlaid by the absolute urgency of this one. Ascanius ran beside him, with his small legs working as fast as they could. Anchises was heavy on his shoulders, in the way that old men are heavy. Not the solid weight of a warrior, but the dense weight of a body that has carried years. The sacred objects clinked softly against each other in Anchises' arms. They reached the gate. They passed through it. They came out onto the ground beyond the walls of Troy into the dark outside the city. And Aeneas felt the particular sensation of having escaped something that he had believed he would die inside, a sensation so disorienting that for a moment he could not process it as relief. He put his father down. He turned to gather the rest of his family. Creusa was not there. He looked back at the empty space where she should have been. He looked at Ascanius and at Anchises. He looked at the men who had escaped with him, the small group of Trojans who had followed the prince through the burning streets. He asked if anyone had seen her. No one had seen her. What Aeneas did next is one of the things the Aeneid records about him that makes him different from other ancient heroes. He went back into the burning city, which was by this point entirely in Greek hands, calling his wife's name. He moved through streets that were now fully occupied by the army that had spent 10 years trying to get inside them. He called for Creusa in the dark. He found nothing. The shade of Creusa came to him near the house they had lived in. She appeared the way the dead appear in ancient stories, insubstantial and calm. Already somewhere beyond the emergency that was still consuming everyone and everything around her. She told him what had happened with the measured kindness of someone who has already processed it. She had been separated in the confusion. The divine mother of the gods, the great goddess herself, had stopped her. It was not random. It was not simply the chaos of a collapsing city finding its next victim. It had been arranged. She told him that she was not coming with him, that what waited for him was not for her, that somewhere beyond the sea and beyond the journey that was coming, there was a new home and a new life and a new woman who would stand beside him in that life, a royal woman in a western land whose destiny would intersect with his in ways neither of them could currently understand. She told him to grieve her, but not too long. She told him that she was already somewhere that grief could not reach, and then she was gone. He reached for her 3 times and found nothing. She was gone. Aeneas returned to the gate with what he had, his father, his son. A small group of Trojan survivors who had gathered around him in the dark, people who had nowhere else to go, and who recognized in Aeneas's movement through the catastrophe something worth following. Women and men and children, the remnants of a civilization walking away from its ruins in the dark before dawn. He led them up into the mountains above Troy, above the fires, into the cold air that smelled of pine and was mercifully free of smoke. They watched the city burn from above, the glow of it visible for miles in the dark. The 1,000 years of what Troy had been reduced to light and heat, and eventually ash. He did not go back down. Let us pause here and breathe slowly. You have been in a burning city. You have watched a man carry his father through the ruins of everything he knew. You have felt the particular weight of a story that begins in catastrophe and that has somewhere ahead of it. You can sense this even now, the possibility of something that justifies the survival. If you are still awake enough to move your hand, drop a comment right now. Tell us where you are, your city, your time, whatever you want to share. We are building something in this comment section, and your location is part of it. Now let us follow Aeneas across the sea. The Trojans spent time in the mountains above the ruined city, gathering themselves and gathering numbers. More survivors found their way to where Aeneas's group had stopped. They built ships from the timber of the mountain forests, the same forests that had provided wood for the great wooden horse that had ended the war they had just survived. There is something in that detail that the ancient commentators noted without fully explaining. The timber of Troy's destruction becoming the timber of Troy's continuation. Anchises, alive on the other side of the catastrophe he had been willing to die in, became the elder of this small floating civilization. He was not useless after all. He was the one who had survived long enough to carry the accumulated knowledge of who they were and what they were descended from. And in the early months of the voyage, when the question of who the Trojans were now that Troy no longer existed was the most pressing question they faced, Anchises was the person who could answer it. They were the people of Aeneas. They were the carriers of the household gods. They were the remnant of something that had been destroyed. And that would be built again somewhere. That was who they were. The first years of the voyage were difficult in ways that tested this identity constantly. They tried to settle in Thrace, on the northern coast of the Aegean, a region that had been friendly to Troy during the war. They began to build, and then Aeneas found a myrtle bush that bled when he tried to uproot it. And the voice that came from the bleeding bush was the voice of a Trojan who had been murdered there by the Thracian king, who had been bribed by the Greeks. The land was polluted by treachery. They left. They tried Crete, where the ancient oracle had suggested they might find their ancestral homeland. They began to build. A plague came, striking the animals and then the people. The household gods appeared to Aeneas in a dream and told him that Crete was not the place. Italy was the place, the western land, Hesperia. That was where his grandfather had come from in the earliest genealogies, and that was where the new walls were waiting to be built. They left. They encountered the Harpies on the Strophades Islands. The Harpies were creatures of divine punishment, beings that existed at the intersection between bird and woman in the mythology of the ancient Greeks, assigned to torment those whom the gods had condemned and to foul any food that human beings tried to eat in their vicinity. The Trojans came to the islands because they saw wild cattle and goats and believed they had found a place to resupply. They slaughtered the animals. They began to cook. The Harpies came. Their leader Celaeno, the Dark One, delivered a prophecy as they drove the Trojans from the feast. She told them that they would reach Italy. She told them that before they could build their city, they would be so hungry that they would eat their tables. It sounded like a curse. It would turn out to be something else entirely. They sailed north and east, following the advice of the prophet Helenus, a Trojan seer who had ended up in Epirus through the complicated redistributions of the war's aftermath, and who had, remarkably, found himself ruling a small kingdom there beside Andromache, Hector's widow. The site of Andromache when Aeneas's fleet put in at this harbour is one of the Aeneid's stranger and more haunting passages. She was performing funeral rites for Hector at a replica of Troy's tomb that Helenus had built in Epirus, a miniature version of the city she had lost, because the grief of the Trojan women was profound enough and sustained enough that they built models of what they mourned. When she looked up and saw Aeneas and the Trojan fleet, she could not initially process what she was seeing. Was this real? Were these her people? Was she dreaming, as she often dreamed of Troy, and were these the figures that grief assembled out of memory? It was real. And the conversation that followed between Aeneas and Andromache in this small replica of a lost city carried every gram of what the fall of Troy had actually cost the people inside it. She asked about Ascanius. She asked if the boy was growing well. She had a gift for him, a cloak she had woven herself. The son of Hector would have been this age now, she said. Astyanax would have been this age. Helenus told Aeneas everything he knew about the voyage ahead. Avoid the eastern coast of Sicily, because Scylla and Charybdis were there, the same two horrors that Odysseus had navigated. Go around Sicily's western coast instead. Approach the western coast of Italy with caution. Find the Cumaean Sibyl, the great prophetess near Naples, and ask her everything. She would know things that Helenus could not see. She would provide the guidance the journey needed at its most critical point. And pray to Juno, Helenus added. This was not casual advice. Juno, the queen of the gods, the goddess who had hated Troy with the particular sustained fury of someone who had been insulted, and who had both the time and the power to act on that insult indefinitely, was still active in her opposition to the Trojan survivors. The judgment of Paris, in which Paris had given the golden apple to Aphrodite instead of Juno, had produced a hatred that the fall of Troy had not satisfied. Juno wanted the Trojans erased. She wanted their line ended. She wanted the divine will that had apparently ordained an Italian destiny for Aeneas's people to be frustrated and delayed, and ideally prevented altogether. She was not going to stop. Pray to her anyway, Helenus said. Soften her where you can, offer what you can. Do not give her more reasons for anger. They sailed around the toe of Italy's boot. They rounded Sicily's western coast as instructed, and then Aeneas's father Anchises died. The death of Anchises happens in the first book of the Aeneid, in the kind of compressed, almost understated way that ancient epic poetry sometimes delivers its most devastating moments. He had survived the fall of Troy. He had been carried through the burning city on his son's shoulders. He had sustained the identity of the Trojan survivors through the first difficult years of wandering, and then, on the island of Sicily, he died, of age, of exhaustion, of the accumulated weight of everything he had survived and witnessed. He simply stopped. Aeneas buried him in Sicily with full ceremony, with the games and the funeral rites that the Romans would later make famous as the proper way to honour the heroic dead. He stayed on the island long enough to do it right, and then he sailed west again, carrying his father's loss the way he had carried his father's body as something he would not put down. It was north of Sicily, in the open sea, that Juno finally struck. The queen of the gods had been watching the Trojans navigate successfully around every obstacle she had put in their path, and she had reached a point that the epic describes with unusual psychological insight for a divine being, the point of frustrated fury at which pride overrides all other considerations. She went to Aeolus, the keeper of the winds, and she offered him a bribe that she clearly found humiliating to offer. She would give him the most beautiful of her nymphs as a wife if he would open his windbag and release the storms against Aeneas's fleet. Aeolus agreed. What happened to Aeneas's fleet in the storm that followed is described in the opening lines of the Aeneid with a violence that Virgil very rarely used elsewhere in the poem, because it was meant to establish from the very beginning the scale of the forces working against this man, and therefore the scale of what his survival required. The waves reached the stars. The winds came from every direction simultaneously. Men who had survived the fall of Troy screamed and called on death to take them rather than the sea. Ships were separated. Some were driven onto rocks. The helmsman of one ship was struck by a massive wave and drowned before Aeneas could reach him. Neptune, the god of the sea, felt the disturbance in his domain and rose to see what was causing it. When he understood that Juno had gone to Aeolus and arranged a storm in his ocean without consulting him, he was angry in the way that powerful people are angry when someone acts in their domain without permission. A cold and functional anger that expressed itself immediately in action rather than in words. He rebuked the winds directly and ordered them back to their keeper. He smoothed the sea himself, driving his divine chariot across the surface and lifting the mist and pulling the ships away from the rocks and steadying everything that Juno's storm had thrown into chaos. The fleet was scattered. The 12 ships that Aeneas had sailed from Sicily were now perhaps 7 ships making their way toward each other in the calming sea, their crews shaken and their stores soaked and their sense of divine protection seriously challenged. They found each other near a coastline that none of them recognized, and they put into the nearest sheltered bay to assess the damage and feed the people who had not eaten in the chaos of the storm. Aeneas climbed a cliff above the bay and counted the ships he could see in the water below. 7. He looked for more. He could not find more. He stood on the cliff, and he looked out at the sea that had taken the other ships, and he felt what anyone standing above a loss of that scale feels. He felt it completely and alone, because the leader cannot feel it publicly in front of the people who need to believe that the situation is manageable. Then he came back down. He told his people that they would be all right. He said it in the particular way that leaders say things they are not certain are true, but that they know need to be said. He told them they had survived worse. He pointed out that they were alive and on land, and that the sea had let them out, which was more than could be said for people it had decided to keep. He said that one day this would be a story they told, that one day they would sit in a settled place and look back on this moment and find in it the beginning of something rather than the end. And then he sent hunters into the forest above the bay to bring back food. The bay they had entered was on the North African coast, the coastline of modern Tunisia, across the Mediterranean from Sicily, is where the Aeneid places the Trojan landfall after the storm, and on the hill above the bay, visible through the trees as the Trojan hunting parties moved upward, was a city under construction. The city being built on that hill was Carthage, and its queen was Dido. Let us breathe here again. You have been on a ship in a storm sent by a goddess. You have survived. You have come to a shore you did not plan to reach. And somewhere above you, through the trees, a city is being built by a woman who has her own version of everything that has happened to you. If you have not commented yet, please do it now. Type where you are. Type Knuity or news to me. We genuinely read them all, and we love them. Even if you think your comment is too simple, or that too many people have already said the same thing, yours is not the same. It is yours, and it came from wherever you are in the world. And that matters. Now, Dido is the character in the Aeneid who has made readers stop since the poem was first read aloud in Rome. She is not the hero of the poem is Aeneas's, but she is, by many readers' accounting, its most fully realised and most heartbreaking figure. She is the queen, who has been running from her own catastrophe for her entire adult life. She is the woman whose love for Aeneas will be the most complete and most destructive thing in the poem, and she is, in ways that will become clear as the story unfolds, a mirror for what Aeneas himself has lost, and might have chosen differently under different circumstances. Her story before the Aeneid begins is a story that Virgil tells in compressed form, but that other ancient sources preserve in more detail. She was a princess of Tyre, a great Phoenician trading city on the coast of what is now Lebanon. Her name at birth was Elissa. Her husband, a wealthy priest named Cycus, was murdered by her brother Pygmalion, the king of Tyre, who wanted Cycus's fortune and who killed him in secret, and then lied to Dido about what had happened for long enough to take what he wanted. The ghost of Cycus came to Dido in a dream. As in the Aeneid, as in so many ancient stories, the dead find ways to tell the living what the living need to know. He showed her the wound that had killed him. He told her the truth about who had done it, and he told her to run. She ran. She gathered the people of Tyre, who were willing to follow her, the people who hated Pygmalion's rule, and who saw in Elissa a leadership that was worth the risk of flight. She took the treasury. She took everything that could be taken. She led her people out of Tyre by night and across the sea to the North African coast, and there she bargained with the local Berber king Iarbas for enough land to settle on. The bargain she struck was clever in the particular way of someone who has learned that survival requires cleverness. She asked for as much land as could be enclosed by a single ox hide. Iarbas agreed, presumably laughing to himself at the smallness of the request. Dido cut the ox hide into the thinnest possible strips, and with those strips enclosed the entire hill that would become Carthage. By the time Aeneas's fleet arrives at her coast, she has built a city. Not in the process of building, has built. In the years since she fled Tyre, Dido has created from nothing a functioning Phoenician city-state, with walls and harbours and streets and a legal system, and the beginning of a prosperity that will eventually make Carthage one of the great powers of the Mediterranean world. She has done this while refusing to remarry, while holding off the pressure of Iarbas and other North African kings who saw the widow queen as a political opportunity, while maintaining the loyalty of a people who had followed her out of everything they knew into an unknown coast, and who trusted her because she had earned it. Aeneas walks up the hill toward this city that he can see being built through the trees, and he feels something he has not felt in some time. He feels hope. Not the desperate sustaining hope that leaders manufacture for their people, but the quiet, genuine hope of someone who sees evidence that human beings can build something from nothing, even after everything has been taken from them. He watches the workers laying stone and fitting timber and hauling material. He watches the organization of labor and the efficiency of purpose that a city under good leadership has. He compares it to the images from the night Troy fell, and he feels the comparison as something close to physical. Venus, his divine mother, had been watching all of this. She had seen the storm Juno sent. She had watched her son scramble for the rocks and emerge alive, and make his way to this Carthaginian bay. and she had gone to Jupiter to complain about what Juno was doing and to extract a confirmation that the fate she had been promised for Aeneas was still the operative divine plan. Jupiter confirmed it. He told Venus the full outline of what was going to happen in the way that only a god with complete foreknowledge could tell it. He described the line of kings that would descend from Aeneas. He described the city that would eventually be built in Italy. He named the empire that would eventually rise from it. He used the phrase imperium sine fine, empire without end, to describe what was coming. Everything Juno was doing was delay, he said, not prevention. The destination was fixed. The journey was merely going to take longer than it needed to. Venus was somewhat reassured. She descended to the coast of North Africa and arranged a divine mist around Aeneas and his companion Achates as they walked toward Carthage, a concealment that would let them observe the city and its queen without being seen before they were ready to be seen. Aeneas, invisible in the mist, walked through Carthage and watched it live. He saw the courts of law. He saw the markets. He saw the harbour being organised and the buildings going up. And inside the great temple that Dido was building to Juno, the goddess who had helped the Phoenicians as much as she had hated the Trojans, he saw something that stopped him. The walls of the temple were decorated with scenes from the Trojan War, painted in detail, accurate in their rendering of the battles and the heroes and the events that he had lived through and that he had assumed were known only to the people who had been inside them. And seeing the war he had survived depicted on the walls of a temple in North Africa, knowing that the story had travelled this far, knowing that even here the suffering and the glory of Troy had left its mark, Aeneas felt tears come to his eyes for the first time since the night the city fell. The tears mattered, not because crying is a weakness, but because the absence of them since that night had been its own kind of damage, the compression of grief that survival requires and that cannot be sustained indefinitely without cost. Seeing Troy on the walls of Dido's temple broke something open that had been held closed for a long time. He said something to Achates that the Aeneid preserves as one of its most famous lines. He said that even here, even in this far place, there are tears for things and mortal things touch the mind. Sunt lacrimae rerum et mentem mortalia tangent. There are tears for things. Perhaps the most compressed summary of what it means to be human that ancient literature produced. Everything passes, everything ends, and the ending matters. The tears are real. At that moment Dido arrived at the temple, surrounded by her attendants, moving with the particular quality of authority that someone who has earned, rather than inherited their power, tends to have. She held audiences in the outer courtyard of the temple, hearing the petitions of her people and making judgments with what Virgil describes as an equal and fair mind. She was at work. She was ruling. The divine mist dissolved. Aeneas and Achates appeared before Dido as themselves. Visible suddenly in the morning light, 2 Trojan men in the outer courtyard of her temple. One of them with an expression that she could probably identify from her own face as the look of someone who has survived something enormous and has not yet fully processed it. She recognized them. She knew who they were, because other Trojans from the scattered fleet had already arrived at Carthage and had been received by her and had explained who and what they were. She knew the story of the fall of Troy. She knew the names. She welcomed Aeneas to Carthage with the kind of hospitality that great leaders show to great guests, the hospitality that is both genuine warmth and political intelligence. She told him that her own history made her capable of understanding the suffering of those who had lost everything. She said she was not ignorant of trouble. She offered the Trojans shelter and assistance, and the option of either continuing their voyage or staying in Carthage. Aeneas thanked her. He thanked her in the formal ancient language of gratitude between people who are aware that they are conducting something more than a simple transaction. He brought Ascanius from the ships. the child who had run through Troy's streets holding his father's hand, who was now standing in an African queen's palace, looking around at this new place with the adaptability of children who have seen enough change to know that the world keeps going after catastrophe. Dido looked at the boy. Something in her face shifted when she saw him. Venus had been watching this meeting, and she made a decision. She could see that Juno was still active in her opposition to the Trojan mission, and she was not confident that Dido's hospitality, however genuine it appeared, would survive Juno's interference. She decided to ensure the situation. She sent Cupid to Carthage, disguised as Ascanius. She had Ascanius himself carried off to Cyprus and kept safe and comfortable, and she had Cupid, wearing the child's face, go to Dido during the evening feast that the queen had ordered in the Trojans' honour. Dido held the child she believed was Ascanius during the feast. She held him in her arms with the particular tenderness of a woman who has no children of her own, who has been too busy surviving and then building to arrange for children of her own, who feels in the weight of this boy something that she had not known she was missing. And as she held him, the poison of Cupid's influence moved through her the way it always moved, not as a sudden, overwhelming sensation, but as a gentle shift in the direction of everything, a reorientation of attention and desire that felt, to the person experiencing it, entirely like her own feeling. By the end of the feast, Dido was in love with Aeneas. She did not know it yet. She felt it as something else, as interest and admiration, and the particular pleasure of being in the company of someone whose qualities matched her own. She stayed at the feast longer than she had planned. She asked Aeneas questions. She listened to his answers with the quality of attention that you give to people who interest you in ways that make you want to understand them better. When the feast was finally over and the guests had departed, she went to her rooms and she could not sleep. She went to her sister Anna the next morning, and what she said to Anna is one of the most carefully observed passages in all of ancient literature. She described what she was feeling. She said that she recognized something in Aeneas. She said his qualities were exactly the qualities she had valued and missed since Sichaeus died. She said that if she had not promised herself never to remarry, if she had not sworn to her dead husband's memory that she would keep faith with his love, then this man might be the man she had been looking for. And then she said something that tells you everything you need to know about who Dido is under the queen's authority and the city builder's capability. She said that she wished she could feel this and not be afraid of it. She wished her heart were not already promised to someone who was dead. Anna told her to stop being afraid. Anna told her to think practically about what a union with Aeneas would mean for Carthage, what allies he would bring, what protection against the other North African kingdoms that had been pressing on them since they arrived. Anna told her to think about what she deserved after everything she had done and survived. She told her to offer sacrifice to the gods and to see what the signs said. The signs were ambiguous in the way that divine signs are ambiguous when the gods themselves are in disagreement about what should happen. Dido sacrificed at 4 altars. She walked through the temple of Juno with Aeneas beside her, interpreting the sacred objects and the flame and the incense in the way that educated ancients learned to interpret them. She ate as little as she had eaten in years, distracted from food by something that was more interesting. She walked along the city walls with Aeneas and showed him the project, pointed out what was being built where and why, and when she pointed, she sometimes let his hand guide hers for a moment longer than pointing strictly required. She did not sleep. She was lit from within by the particular energy of new feeling, the energy that makes buildings look sharper and food taste better, and the sounds of a city at work seem like music. She walked through Carthage in this condition, and the city moved around her, like something she was experiencing for the first time. She went to the place she had laid Sichaeus's memory. She prayed at it. The sacred flame of the altar wavered in a way that she could interpret either as permission or as warning, depending on what she was prepared to see. Juno saw all of this. She went to Venus. What Juno proposed to Venus was a truce of sorts, grounded not in any actual cessation of hostility, but in a shared interest in the immediate situation. Juno wanted the Trojans to stay in Carthage. If Aeneas settled in Carthage and married Dido, the Trojan line would mix with the Phoenician line, and the Italy destiny would never materialize. The prophecy of an empire would be indefinitely delayed. Venus agreed carefully, not because she believed Juno's offer was genuine, but because she could see that Jupiter's plan was operating on a longer timeline than Juno was thinking about, and because she wanted to protect Aeneas in the immediate term from the other dangers that Juno could deploy if negotiations broke down. Juno arranged a hunt. The hunt that Dido and Aeneas went on with the Carthaginian court was exactly the kind of elaborate royal display that great powers conducted to show each other their magnificence. Horses and hounds. Hunting gear of extraordinary quality. The assembled nobility of Carthage alongside the Trojan leaders, and Dido herself, stunning in a purple riding cloak with a golden clasp, her hair bound up under a jewelled pin, moving through the morning forest at the head of the procession with the kind of effortless authority that had been accumulating around her since the night she decided to flee Tyre. Aeneas rode beside her. They moved through the forest together with the particular ease of two people who are discovering that they inhabit shared space naturally, whose movements and responses and silences fit together without requiring adjustment. The storm Juno sent was specifically timed. It came suddenly and completely. Lightning and rain and thunder that scattered the hunting party across the forest, sending horses in every direction and the Carthaginian nobles toward whatever shelter they could find. In the confusion and the rain, Dido and Aeneas found the same cave, the lightning outside, the rain, the darkness of the cave, the two of them standing in it, breathing hard from the galloping that the storm had required, the water running from their hair, aware of nothing in the world except each other, and the space between them that was getting smaller. Juno, watching from the divine plane, performed the rites of the marriage goddess. Earth and sky were witness. The lightning was the wedding torch. The nymphs in the hills raised their voices for the wedding cry. Whether or not what happened in the cave that afternoon was technically a marriage in any sense that either Dido or Aeneas's world would have recognized as legally binding depended on questions of Carthaginian law and Trojan custom and divine interpretation that the ancient commentators argued about extensively. What is not in doubt is what happened to Dido afterward. She called it a marriage. She believed it was a marriage. She stopped hiding how she felt about Aeneas. She presented him publicly as her partner in the rule of Carthage. She made no distinction in her mind between what they were now and what she had been with Sychaeus. She was married again. She had allowed herself to love again, and she threw herself into that love with the same total commitment that she had thrown into everything else in her extraordinary life. Carthage stopped being built. This is the detail that the Aeneid uses to indicate that something has gone wrong. The construction that had been moving so efficiently when Aeneas first watched it through the trees from the concealment of Venus's mist, the cranes and the stone laying, and the organized labor of a city being raised from nothing, came to a halt. The workers stood at their unfinished projects and waited for instructions that did not come because the queen was otherwise occupied. The towers stopped rising. The harbours sat half-finished. The streets that had been buzzing with purposeful activity went quiet, and in the palace, Dido and Aeneas were together in the way that people are together when they have decided that the present is sufficient and the future is a problem for later. Rumour flew across the world. The ancient Romans personified rumour as a creature, a being that moved through the earth and the air simultaneously, growing larger with every step it took, acquiring new details and new distortions at every city it touched. The rumour that flew from Carthage was simple. The Trojan guest and the Carthaginian queen were together. The city was not being built. The queen had forgotten her duty in the grip of a love that her dignity should not have allowed. It reached Iarbas, the North African king who had sold Dido the land for Carthage, and who had been waiting ever since for some opportunity to claim what he felt was owed to him. He went to Jupiter's temple, and he prayed the prayer of a man who has always believed he was entitled to something, and who is now watching someone else have it. He asked Jupiter why a foreign Trojan vagabond should have what he, a son of Jupiter himself, had been denied. Jupiter heard. He was already aware that the delay in Italy was extending beyond what the plan required. He sent Mercury. The divine messenger descended to Carthage as he had descended elsewhere in the story of the Trojans, moving between the divine world and the human one with the easy grace of a being for whom the distance is nothing. He found Aeneas overseeing construction work in Carthage with the quality of someone who has settled in, who has begun to think of this place as home, who has started to make long-term plans in a location that was supposed to be a stop on a journey. Mercury stood before him and delivered Jupiter's message with the directness that divine messengers used when the message was urgent, and there was no point in softening it. Forget Carthage. Forget the queen. Think about Ascanius. Think about what you owe the boy in terms of future, in terms of destiny, in terms of the Italian kingdom that is waiting for him, and for the descendants who will come after him. You are building Carthage. You should be building the walls that are waiting for you in the west. What are you doing? What are you thinking? Go. Mercury disappeared. Aeneas stood in Carthage with the divine voice still in his ears, and felt what the epic describes as a sensation of sudden heat, of something jolting him back into himself, from a state that had felt like being himself, but that was clearly not. He understood immediately what he had to do. He did not question it. The divine mandate was absolute, and he had known since the night Troy fell exactly what kind of person he was in relationship to divine mandates. He gathered the Trojan leaders secretly. He told them to prepare the fleet. He told them to do it quietly, not announcing the departure, not doing anything that would reach the queen before he was ready to speak to her himself. He needed to find the right moment to tell her. There was no right moment. Dido found out from rumour, which had watched the fleet preparations from the moment they began, and had travelled to her with the news before Aeneas could. She came to him with what the Aeneid describes as a kind of madness in her eyes. Not the madness of someone who has lost their mind, but the madness of someone who is experiencing something so extreme that ordinary composure cannot contain it. What she said to him is one of the most complete and most devastating speeches in ancient literature. She asked him if he had really been planning to leave without telling her. She asked if their time together, everything they had been to each other, meant nothing to him. She reminded him of everything she had given him. She had taken him in when he had nothing. She had shared her city, her resources, her reputation, her life with him. She had made enemies on his behalf. She had set aside the other alliances she could have made. She asked him where he planned to go. Did he know what he was sailing toward in this Italy that the gods kept pointing him at? Was there anything there that was as real as what was here? And then she said the thing that tells you who she is. She told him that, if she had been pregnant, if there was any chance she had already given him something that would survive his departure, she would be less alone. She would have a small version of him, some part of him that would stay with her even as he left. But there was nothing, and she was alone with the loss. Aeneas held the expression of a man who is doing the hardest thing he has ever done, which is standing still while someone he loves is in pain that he is causing and that he cannot address without doing a worse thing, which is staying and abandoning his destiny. He told her that he had never promised marriage. He told her that the gods required him to leave, and that his obedience to divine will was not something he could put aside even for her, even for what they had been to each other. He told her he would carry her with him as long as he lived. She looked at him, and she said something that the ancient world understood as both a curse and a prophecy. She said that she would pursue him with dark fires wherever he went. And when she was cold in death, she would still hear of it, she would still know, and her shade would be there. She turned and left him there. She was carried from the courtroom, barely conscious. She went to her rooms, she wept. She began to make a plan that she told her sister Anna was a plan to use magic to either bring him back or release her from the feeling. She had Anna build a pyre in the courtyard of the palace. She had Aeneas's belongings brought out, his clothing and his weapons and everything he had left in the palace, and she had them placed on the pyre. The bed that had been theirs was brought out too. She told Anna it was for the ritual. She was lying. The fleet left in the grey before dawn, Aeneas giving the orders in the dark, the ships moving out of the harbour with the efficiency of people who have been ready for this for days. He watched the shore of Carthage recede behind him, and he saw the fires that Dido had lit on the hills above the city. He did not know what they were. He watched them, and he had a feeling, the epic says, the kind of feeling that arrives before understanding does, that something was ending on that shore as he watched. He was right. Dido stood at the top of the pyre she had built in the courtyard of her palace. She had sent Anna away on a false errand, so she would not witness this. She spoke Aeneas's name. She spoke her own name. She spoke the names of what they had been to each other. She called on the powers of the earth and of the underworld, and on anyone who might hear her and understand. And then she fell onto the sword that had been Aeneas's gift to her. The Queen of Carthage died on the morning that the Trojan fleet sailed west. She was found by her servants, who raised the cry that spread through Carthage like a second fall of Troy, the sound of a people discovering they had lost the person who had made them possible. Anna arrived and knelt beside her sister and tried to call her back with words and then with breath. Juno, looking down at the dying woman who had been caught between the two divine powers fighting over the Trojan future, took pity on her. She sent Iris to release Dido from the dying that was taking too long. Iris descended in her rainbow, touched the strand of hair that indicated the life thread was not yet fully cut and took it. Dido died. Her warmth left her body. The life she had built and the love she had felt went with it. On the sea below, the Trojan fleet sailed west toward Italy, and the destiny that had always been waiting. Let the story rest here. If you have been with us this far, you have been inside something extraordinary tonight. You have watched two people who deserved, better than what their circumstances gave them, do what their circumstances required. You have watched a city queen built from nothing and a civilization survivor find each other at exactly the wrong time. You have watched love that was real be insufficient to overcome destiny. This is why the Aeneid has been read for 2,000 years. Not because it celebrates empire, though it does that too, but because it knows that the cost of great things is always paid by people who did not choose to pay it and who pay it anyway. Drop us a comment before you sleep. Tell us where you are. Tell us if Dido's story broke your heart, because it should. And tell us whether you think Aeneas made the right choice. People have been arguing about that for 2,000 years, and we want to know where you stand. Type Aeneas or Dido in the comments, no explanation needed, just the name of the one you think deserved better. We will be reading every answer sleeved now. The fleet is at sea. The story is not over. There is Italy still ahead, and the underworld, and the war, and the founding of something that will last 1,000 years. We will find it together when you wake. Good night. If you are still here, still drifting somewhere between sleep and the ancient world, welcome back to the story of the man who carried his father out of a burning city and sailed west across the Mediterranean toward a destiny that the gods had decided, and that he had not chosen and that he was going to fulfill anyway, because that was the kind of man he was. We left him on the sea after leaving Carthage. Dido was dead on the shore behind him, though he did not know it yet. He had only the feeling, which the epic records as something that arrived before understanding did, the feeling that something had ended on that Carthaginian shore, as he watched the fires from the deck of his ship in the grey before dawn. Before we continue, I need you to do something for me right now while you are still awake enough to move your hand. Leave a comment below. Tell us where in the world you are and what the time is there. We are building a picture of where this story finds people, and we cannot do that without you. Also, if you are listening in the United States, drop your state. We want to know which states have the most history lovers, and we genuinely cannot tell without the data that you provide in the comments. Like this video too if it is carrying you somewhere tonight. Both of those actions cost you 30 seconds, and they change what this channel is able to do. We are grateful for every single one now. The fleet turned back towards Sicily. The return to Sicily was not Aeneas's preferred route. He had intended to sail directly to Italy after leaving Carthage. But the winds that came up against them after the fleet passed the Carthaginian coast were unfavourable in the particular sustained way that made any experienced sailor understand that the sea was telling them something. The steersman Palinurus came to Aeneas and told him what the stars and the wind were indicating. They could not make Italy on this heading in these conditions without spending the whole night fighting for every mile. Better to turn back to Sicily, where Aeneas's Trojan ally and kinsman Acestes ruled a settlement of Trojan descendants on the island's northwest coast, and wait for the conditions to improve. Aeneas agreed. He knew Sicily already. He had buried his father Anchises there. The island had been the last land they had seen before the storm Juno sent had scattered the fleet and driven them to Carthage's shore. Returning to it now felt like completing a circle, like being returned to the last stable point before everything had become complicated. Acestes came down to the beach when he saw Aeneas's fleet approaching, and he came with the particular warmth of someone who has been waiting a long time for a visitor whose return he was not entirely sure of. He was dressed in the skin of a Libyan bear and carried 2 hunting javelins. He greeted Aeneas with embraces, and with the kind of immediate generous welcome that the Aeneid consistently presents as the highest expression of human virtue, the willingness to give freely to those who arrive in need. The Trojans came ashore and lit their fires on the Sicilian beach, and they were full of the particular gratitude of people who have been at sea in difficult conditions and have reached land that is familiar and safe. The food that Acestes' people brought to the beach that evening was better than anything they had eaten on the ship, and it tasted better still for being given without calculation. And Aeneas remembered. The next morning he gathered his people and told them what day it was. It had been exactly 1 year since Anchises died on this same island. 1 full year since they had buried the old man, who had survived Troy on his son's shoulders, and who had died in Sicily before he could see the new land that all of this suffering was supposed to deliver them to. 1 year. The proper thing to do was to honour the dead with games. The funeral games for Anchises are the central set piece of the 5th book of the Aeneid, and they served a purpose in Virgil's poem beyond simple narrative variety. They were the Roman poet's way of showing what Roman values looked like in practice, what the civilization that was supposedly about to emerge from the ashes of Troy would eventually stand for and celebrate and judge men by. The games were the distillation of everything that the Romans believed made a man worth honouring, 9 days of sacrifice and ceremony. On the 10th day the games began. The first event was the boat race, and Virgil describes it with the same kind of enthusiastic specificity that modern writers use for sports events they love and want to communicate the excitement of to people who might not naturally feel it. 4 ships competed, each named for a mythological creature and each crewed by Trojan sailors whose competitiveness was as real as any modern athlete's. The dolphin, captained by Menestheus, the chimera, enormous and intimidating, under Gyas, the centaur under Sergestus, and the Scylla under the young Cloanthus, whose eventual victory would be the first surprise of the games. The course was around a rock in the harbour marked with a garland, close enough to the shore that the watching crowd could see every decision the captains made. The strategy that won was simple and executed perfectly. Cloanthus, in the Scylla, held the inside line so tightly on the turn that his oars were almost scraping the rock, while the other captains flinched away from the danger. He came out of the turn with a lead that the other ships could not close, and he prayed to the sea gods with the intensity of someone who means the prayer rather than performing it. And the sea gods heard him and helped him the way they sometimes help those who ask with their whole heart. Gyas, losing badly in the Chimera, threw his helmsman overboard for being too cautious. The helmsman swam to the rock and sat on it dripping and watching the rest of the race with the expression of a man who had just been thrown overboard for being too cautious, which was not an expression that invited easy description. The crowd on shore, who had watched the whole thing, laughed. This detail the Aeneid preserves because it was true, because people have always laughed at authority making a spectacle of itself, and because even in the middle of a solemn funeral commemoration, the human capacity for finding absurdity funny does not disappear. The foot race that followed demonstrated what Aeneas was up against in building a civilization from the remnants of a catastrophe. The three fastest runners were young men who were also competitive enough that the race itself did not quite survive their competitiveness intact. Nisus was in the lead when he slipped in the blood of slaughtered oxen that had been left on the track, and rather than simply recover and continue, he threw himself in the path of the man behind him, the man who was his rival, so that his friend Euryalus, who was coming third, could win instead. The crowd, watching Euryalus cross the finish line with blood on his knees from the fall he had been spared, was divided about how to feel. What Nisus had done was both deeply loyal and deeply dishonest, and the ancient crowd's reaction to that combination was the same as a modern crowd's would be. Aeneas dealt with it the way a good leader deals with messy situations where the rules and the genuine values are not quite aligned. He gave prizes to everyone, including to the man who had been knocked over by Nisus's sacrifice. He acknowledged what had happened without making it worse by pretending it was simple. He moved on to the boxing. The boxing was dominated by an old man named Entellus, who had been the champion of his generation, and who had not competed in years because of his age, and the way that the weight of years had settled on him in the manner of someone who had once been enormous and was now enormous plus years. He came forward when no young Trojan champion was willing to face Dares, the only Trojan who volunteered, and he came forward the way champions who have been watching young people make things look harder than they are sometimes come forward, with the quiet certainty of someone who is about to demonstrate what the thing is actually supposed to look like. The fight was something extraordinary to witness even in Virgil's description, which is necessarily compressed. Entellus was not fast anymore, but he had hit enough things in enough years to know exactly how to position himself relative to someone who was faster, and he let Dares exhaust himself against the geography of his old body, until Dares was off balance, and then he hit him once, with the full force of what he had been conserving. It was the kind of blow that settles the question instantly and completely. Aeneas stopped the fight at this point, not because Entellus was in danger, but because Dares was, and spared the young champion the further consequences of having challenged an old one. Entellus, the excitement of it still moving through him in the way that old physical memories sometimes reactivate when the body is finally called on to use them, turned to the ox that had been brought forward as the prize and hit it once between the eyes with his fist, killing it immediately, and announced that this was better than fighting dares anyway. The archery contest that followed included a moment that the crowd and the Aeneid both treat as a divine sign. 4 competitors shot arrows at a dove tied to a mast. The first 2 cut the rope but missed the bird, which flew free. The third nicked the dove and brought it down injured. The last shot, by Acestes himself shooting at a target that no longer existed because the bird was already falling, fired his arrow into the empty sky, and the arrow caught fire and traced a burning path across the afternoon like a comet before burning out. The crowd went silent. Then Aeneas told them what it meant. He told them it was a sign from the gods. He gave Acestes the first prize regardless of the technical outcome of the contest. And he said it with the authority of a man who has learned to read divine signals and who is confident enough in that reading to act on it publicly. There were equestrian games after that. The young men of the Trojans performing the parade formations that the Romans would later institutionalize as the Lusus Troiae, the Game of Troy. A formal cavalry display that Augustus himself would revive in Virgil's own time, as a connection between the Roman present and the Trojan past that supposedly preceded it. The boys rode in complex formations, and Aeneas watched his own son Ascanius among them, and felt something that the epic does not quite name, but that any parent watching a child perform something difficult well would recognize. Then Juno interfered again. She sent Iris, the rainbow goddess and divine messenger, down to the Trojan women on the beach, disguised as an elderly Trojan woman named Beroe. The women had been excluded from the games, watching from the shore, and they were tired, not complaining tired, but the kind of tired that 7 years of wandering and surviving produces in people who have been sustaining the hope that the journey will eventually end in something that was worth all the surviving. Iris as Beroe moved among them and spoke the thought that they had all been having but had not said aloud. Why do they keep sailing? When does this end? How many times can people be asked to pack up the thing they have just managed to make livable and start again somewhere new? They were already in Sicily. Trojan descendants were already here in Acestes' settlement. The beach was good, and the land around it was good, and they were so tired. What was Italy that the Aegean and Libya and Sicily were not? And then she suggested they burn the ships. Several women, including one who noticed that Beroe moved differently from the elderly woman she claimed to be, and who shouted that they needed to think carefully before doing anything irreversible, tried to stop them. But the fire was already starting. Aeneas came running from the games when he saw the smoke. He saw the ships burning. He understood immediately what had happened and who had arranged it. He did what anyone does in a moment when the disaster is already partially accomplished, and the only question is how much of it can be stopped. He prayed. He asked Jupiter directly and loudly on the beach to either help him or send lightning and finish what was already started. Jupiter sent rain. The kind of rain that only the king of the gods sends when he is making a point rather than simply watering crops. It came in quantity and with speed, and it put out the fires that had started and slowed the fires that had been burning longer. 4 ships were lost. The others were saved. Aeneas spent the night trying to figure out what to do. He walked the beach alone and thought about the women who had started the fire and what their exhaustion was telling him about the state of his people, who had been following him for 7 years through a series of disasters, interspersed with brief improvements, and who were reaching the end of what sustained hope feels like when it is repeatedly deferred. The old man Nautis came to him with something that functioned as wisdom, in the way that practical advice from experienced people functions as wisdom, not profound and not divine, but correct. He told Aeneas to leave the ones who were too tired behind, not abandon them, settle them, give them a home on this island with Acestes, who was already building something there, and who had the Trojan blood to make the settlement legitimate. The old, the mothers, the ones who were exhausted beyond recovery, they could stay. the ones who had the will for Italy should go, and then Anchises appeared. Not the Anchises who had died of age and exhaustion on this beach a year ago. The Anchises of a different order of existence. The one who moved through the night as a presence rather than a body. Who could speak, but whose words came with the authority of someone who had access to a wider view than the living can access. He told his son to come down to the underworld. He told him to find the Cumaean Sibyl in Italy, the prophetess who guarded the entrance to the underworld at Cumae near Naples. She would take him down. He needed to see what was waiting for him in the realm of the dead, not for the dead's sake, but for his own. There were things he needed to understand about what he was building and why, and what it would eventually become. Things that could not be communicated in the ordinary way. Then Anchises was gone. Aeneas arranged everything on the beach the next morning. He found the families and individuals who had reached the limit of what they could sustain of the journey, and he settled them with Acestes on the Sicilian coast, giving them the 4 ships that had been burned to destruction as reason to stay rather than evidence of failure. He organized the remaining fleet. He said the goodbyes that partings of that kind require, which are always more complicated than simple departures, because the people staying know they are watching something leave that they are no longer part of, and the people leaving know they are reducing themselves to only those who still believe the destination is worth reaching. They sailed from Sicily on a morning that smelled of pine and sea salt, the Sicilian coast falling behind them for the second time, Italy visible in the imagination somewhere ahead across the water, and Palinurus, the steersman at the helm, with the quiet competence that Aeneas had come to rely on so completely that he had stopped consciously noticing it, the way you stop consciously noticing the sound of breathing when everything is working. What happened to Palinurus on the crossing from Sicily to Italy is one of the moments in the Aeneid that the ancient commentators read as a theological statement and that modern readers tend to read as a tragedy, and that is, perhaps both. Sleep, personified by Virgil as a divine being, was sent against him by Neptune as part of a negotiation between Neptune and Juno about the protection of the Trojan fleet. The sea god would allow Aeneas to reach Italy safely, but one life would be taken on the crossing, Palinurus's life. The god of sleep came to Palinurus at the helm in the middle of the night crossing and tried to knock him unconscious so that he would slip quietly from the ship. Palinurus resisted. He held the tiller with both hands and shook his head and opened his eyes and fought the sleep that was being pressed on him from the outside rather than rising in him from fatigue. He was not tired. He was being attacked by something that wore the face of ordinary drowsiness. He lost. He went over the side, holding the tiller he had refused to release, into the dark water of the crossing between Sicily and Italy, and he sank into the sea, and his name became attached to the headland on Italy's western coast, that the Trojans would pass on their way north, Cape Palinurus, which is still marked on maps of the Italian coast today. Aeneas woke to find the ship steering itself, no helmsman at the helm, the coast of Italy visible ahead in the early morning light. He took the helm himself and he guided the fleet in, calling the names of the stars above him to orient himself, and the coast of the western side of Italy, the Tyrrhenian coast that the Romans would know as Latium's edge, came up in the dawn light with the particular quality that coasts have when you have been approaching them for longer than seemed sustainable. They were in Italy. Let us pause here and breathe. Comment below right now. Tell us where you are in the world. Tell us what you are lying on tonight and what the room sounds like. Tell us whether you have ever stood at the edge of the sea and felt that something was waiting for you on the other side of it. Aeneas felt that for 7 years, and now he was finally on the other side. The Sibyl of Cumae was ancient, not ancient in the way that old people are ancient, the familiar human ancient of grey hair and slower movement. Ancient in the way that the traditions surrounding her suggested she had been there since before the current arrangement of things, that she had made a bargain with Apollo in her youth, for as many years of life as she could hold grains of sand in her hand, that she had held a handful of sand and asked for all the years in it, and had gotten them, and had forgotten to ask for youth along with the years, and was now living through the centuries in the state of someone who is very old and getting older. She lived in a cave above the Bay of Cumae, on the coast just north of what would later be Naples, and the cave was unlike any ordinary dwelling. It had 100 passages carved into the rock, 100 openings through which the divine wind blew when Apollo was communicating through her. And when she prophesied, the words came out as written leaves that the wind scattered from the cave entrance, unless you were quick enough to catch them before they were lost. Aeneas came to her first to pray and to sacrifice at Apollo's temple above the harbour, as Helenus had instructed him when the fleet had stopped at Epirus on the way out of the Aegean world. The temple above Cumae had doors decorated with scenes from Daedalus's story, another refugee who had arrived on these shores with his wings after escaping Crete, who had dedicated his wings to Apollo as an act of thanksgiving, and had begun to carve on the temple doors the history of his own terrible escape, and who had stopped when he reached the part about his son Icarus falling into the sea, unable to put that grief into carved form, even here, even in the dedication of a temple. Grief that was too close could not be rendered. The Sibyl came out of her cave and told Aeneas to stop looking at the artwork and focus on what needed to be done. She took him into the cave for the private consultation that Helenus had sent him here for, and she told him what was coming in Italy, not as encouragement but as honest preparation. There would be wars. The Trojans would face another great conflict before they could settle. Another Achilles had already been born in Latium, another hero who would make the foreign invaders pay an enormous price for every mile they advanced. The cause of the conflict would be another woman who should not have been given in marriage to a foreign visitor. It would be very hard before it was over. Aeneas heard all of this without visible shock. He had developed over 7 years the capacity to absorb terrible news without expressing the reaction to it that would make the people around him less capable of functioning. He nodded at what the Sibyl told him and asked his question, which was the question he had come all this way to ask, and which was not about Italy or the wars or the woman who would cause them. He asked to go down. He asked the Sibyl to take him into the underworld, where his father was waiting to show him something that could not be shown in any other way. He told her he had earned the right. He listed, with the quiet confidence of someone who knows their account is accurate, the things he had survived and the things he had done, and the divine mandate that had been pressing him forward through all of it. He told her that the descent and return was not unprecedented, that others had done it, that Orpheus had done it for love, and Hercules had done it for duty, and Pollux had done it for brotherhood. He was asking for a chance to do it for understanding. The Sibyl told him that what he was asking for required a specific preparation that no amount of courage or divine favour could substitute for. Somewhere in the forest above Cumae there was a tree with a golden bough, a branch that was gold rather than green, hanging among the ordinary foliage of an ordinary forest tree, visible to those the gods wished to admit to the underworld and invisible to everyone else. He needed to find it and break it off and bring it to her. That was the price. She also told him that one of his companions had died during the fleet's arrival at Cumae, and that the body needed to be buried before the descent could begin. The body of the dead companion was polluting the fleet and blocking the way. They found Misenus on the shore. He had been the fleet's trumpet player, a man of exceptional musical skill and exceptional arrogance, who had apparently decided at some point during the voyage that his own playing was good enough to challenge the gods at their own instrument. He had blown his trumpet at the sea's edge in a way that the sea god Triton had taken as a challenge, and Triton had grabbed him and drowned him in the waves. He was lying on the beach when they found him. They gathered the timber for his pyre. Aeneas went into the forest above Cumae looking for the golden bough. He was guided by 2 white doves, birds sacred to Venus who still watched over her son even in his worst moments, who flew ahead of him through the forest at the pace of a man walking with purpose, and who settled in a tree when they reached the place they had been sent to indicate. Aeneas looked up into the tree where the doves were sitting, and he saw what he had come to find. The gold of it was different from the other colours of the forest, in the particular way that one colour is different when it does not belong to the context that surrounds it. He reached up and took hold of it. The bough resisted for a moment, and then came away. He brought it to the Sibyl. The fleet burned Misenus with the full ceremony that his musical service warranted, and then, in the darkness before dawn, Aeneas and the Sibyl went down. The entrance to the underworld at Cumae was a cavern, but the cavern opened almost immediately into something beyond ordinary geography. The space that Aeneas and the Sibyl entered was not simply underground. It was the space that exists between the living and the dead, the territory that has different physics from the world above, where the rules governing time and distance and body and voice do not quite operate in the ways that surface life has trained you to expect. The Sibyl moved through it with the confidence of someone who has been here before. Aeneas stayed close to her. What they passed through on the way to the deeper underworld is described by Virgil with a kind of systematic horror that has the quality of someone who thought very carefully about what the worst things that can happen to a person are, and then arranged them at the entrance to the land of death where they would be encountered first. Grief, anxiety, disease, old age, fear, hunger, poverty, death itself, war, discord. These were the presences that filled the vestibule, the entrance hall. And the Trojans among the living were walking through them with the particular awareness of people who had encountered several of them already, and who were walking through their personifications, now with the knowledge that they were real. The great elm tree at the centre of the vestibule held dreams under every leaf, false dreams that clung to the underside of the branches, and beyond it were the monsters of mythology, centaurs and Scyllus, and the Linnaean Hydra and the Chimera with her fire, whose sheer physical variety suggested that whatever imagination produced the monsters of mythology had been working from a fear that the natural world did not adequately represent the range of things that could go wrong. Aeneas drew his sword at the sight of them. The Sibyl stopped him with a hand on his arm, and told him that they were shades, not bodies. His sword could not touch them. He put it back. They came to the Styx. The river of the dead, the boundary between the vestibule of the underworld and its interior, was not what the living typically imagined it to be. It was not clean and dark and dramatic. It was exactly what a river that carries every human being who has ever died would look like when you stood on its bank and watched the crowd waiting to cross. It was enormous and slow, and the bank was so crowded with the shades of the dead that the number of them could not be resolved into individual figures from where Aeneas was standing. They pressed toward the water. They reached toward Charon, the ferryman, who poled his boat among them looking for the ones who qualified for passage. The ones who qualified were those who had been properly buried. The ones who were still waiting, sometimes for centuries, were those whose bodies had never received the rites that sent them properly to this threshold. Aeneas saw hands reaching toward him and faces that called to him from the crowd of the unburied, and among them he saw the shade of Palinurus, his steersman, who had been thrown overboard in the crossing from Sicily, and whose body was presumably still in the Tyrrhenian Sea. Palinurus told him his story, what had happened on the crossing, and he asked for help. The Sibyl told him he would be buried. The local people of the Italian coast, near where his body had washed up, would eventually honour him and give him the rites he needed. They would call the headland after him. Cape Palinurus. It was already done in the way that things in the underworld exist in relation to time differently from things on the surface. Charon initially refused to take them across. The living did not belong here. He pointed at Aeneas's body, the way it displaced the air and the light differently from the shades around him, the way he had weight and breath, in a place where weight and breath did not exist, and he told them to go back. He was not taking the living across his river. The Sibyl showed him the golden bow. Charon went quiet and let them board the far bank of the Styx, the interior of the underworld. Was organized in a way that reflected a logic the living world sometimes aspires to and rarely achieves. The manner of your life and the manner of your death determined where you went. The good went to Elysium. The wicked went to Tartarus. The ordinary masses went to the asphodel meadows, the vast grey middle where most of humanity spent its afterlife in a diminished version of the ordinary life above. At the threshold of the interior, the three-headed dog Cerberus lay guarding the way. The Sibyl gave him a honeyed cake with herbs in it, that the ancient tradition associated with drugging large and difficult dogs, and he accepted it, and ate it, and went quiet, and let them pass. They passed through the section of the underworld where those who had died in infancy lived, the children who had not had the chance to be what they might have become, and the poets moved through them carefully, because the sadness of that section of the dead has a quality that is different from the sadness of other deaths. Beside it, the meadow of those who died unjustly, condemned to death on false charges, and the judges of the underworld who served this population were reviewing the evidence that the living had suppressed, then the mourning fields. The mourning fields were where the Aeneid went in a direction that every reader since Virgil has felt as a particular kind of weight. They were the realm of those who had died because of love. Those who had been killed by love, or had killed themselves for love, or had been so consumed by love that it had ended them in one way or another. Among them was Dido. She was in the forest section of the mourning fields, among the shadows and the shade trees, and when Aeneas saw her from a distance, he recognized her through the dimness of the underworld light the way you recognize a face. You know very well in imperfect lighting, not by specific features, but by the whole shape of the person, by the way they inhabit their own posture. He recognized her, and he wept. He spoke to her first. He told her that his leaving had not been willful, that the gods had required it, that the same mandate that had brought him to the underworld, the same divine imperative that he had been following since the night Troy fell, had been what drove him from Carthage's harbour. He told her he had not wanted to cause her death. He told her that he had not believed when he left that she would go as far in her grief as she had gone. He asked her to listen to him, because the dead sometimes listened if you asked them correctly. She did not turn toward him. She stood in the shadow of her tree, and she kept her face turned away from him with the absolute fixity of someone who has made the decision to deny someone their gaze, and who is not going to be moved from that decision by appeals to the logic of the situation. She had been through the logic of the situation. She was done with the logic of the situation. He spoke more, he explained more. He apologized in the ways that ancient heroes apologized, which are not quite like the apologies of other traditions, more formal and less personal, and which in this case were exactly the wrong register for the recipient. She turned and walked away from him into the deep shadow, back toward the shade of Sychaeus, her dead husband, who had found her there. And the Aeneid says that Sychaeus returned her grief and matched her love from where he stood in the deep forest of the mourning fields. Aeneas watched her go with tears on his face, and then he followed the Sibyl further down. They passed through the section of the underworld where famous warriors from both sides of the Trojan War lived out their afterlives. Aeneas saw Greeks who recognized him and were afraid of him even in death, their shadowy forms flinching back and turning to run at the sight of the man who had been on the other side of their war. He saw Trojans who came toward him with the eagerness of the dead, who are seeing someone from their living world, who have missed the sight of anyone from the place they came from. He saw Deiphobus, the Trojan who had married Helen after Paris died, who had been killed on the last night of Troy in the most complete and comprehensive way that the Greeks could manage. He saw him whole and knew him, and Deiphobus told him what Helen had done, how she had pointed him out to the Greek soldiers in their marriage chamber on the night the city fell, how she had made herself complicit in his ending before Menelaus could even reach her. Aeneas listened and moved on. The Sibyl was pressing him forward. There was more still to see. Tartarus was visible on their left as they moved through the underworld's geography. Not visible in the sense of being open and accessible, but visible in the sense that its edge was a high cliff from which sounds emerged, and from which the heat and noise of divine punishment reached the living traveller even at a distance. The Sibyl described it to Aeneas as they passed, because she had been inside it, and he could not go there, and she wanted him to understand what it contained. The wicked, the truly wicked, not the ordinarily flawed, who went to the asphodel meadows like everyone else, but those who had committed specific offences that the divine order of things found intolerable, those who had betrayed their brothers, those who had acquired wealth through violence, those who had joined arms against their own people, those who had violated divine hospitality in the specific ways that the ancient world treated as attacks on the fundamental structures of human community. All of them in Tartarus, in the specific punishments that their specific offences required. The Sibyl named the famous ones: Ixion on his wheel, Sisyphus with his boulder, Tantalus standing in water that receded when he tried to drink it, and under fruit that rose when he tried to reach it, the Danaids with their perforated jars, carrying water that never stayed long enough to fill anything, and then, ahead of them, through a different quality of light that the underworld did not use in the regions of punishment and grief, the walls of Elysium. Elysium was the blessed place. The place where those who had earned it lived the afterlife that human goodness, at its best, deserves. Virgil's Elysium has the quality of a place that is genuinely attempting to imagine what a just afterlife would look like for the people who had made the world better. And it does so with a specificity that suggests the Roman poet had thought about it harder than most. The light was different. It had the quality of an alternate sun and stars that the underworld provided independently of the surface world's sky. The air was different. The grass had a vividness that ordinary grass in the daylight world sometimes achieved for a few days in spring, and that Elysium maintained perpetually. Aeneas looked at it and felt something he had not been allowing himself to feel for a very long time, which was the possibility that the suffering he had been organising and sustaining and leading people through for 7 years was pointing at something that was worth it. He asked for Anchises. He was directed to a green valley where Anchises stood looking out over a crowd of souls that were gathered in the light below him, a crowd so vast that its edges were not clearly visible. The accumulated population of the dead who had earned Elysium stretching away into the luminous distance. Anchises was looking at them the way people look at things they love, with a knowledge that they are seeing them in a particular way that will not be available forever. When he saw Aeneas coming down the path toward him, his face changed completely. He spread his arms. He called his son's name. He said the things that the dead say to the living when the living have come through the underworld to find them, which are the same things the living say to each other when they have been separated for longer than separation should be sustained. He said he knew he would come. He said he had been counting on it. He said his love had been right to count on it. Aeneas reached for him. 3 times he reached for him, and 3 times the shade passed through his arms the way air passes through air. He was not solid. He was not there in the way that the living are there. The embrace that Aeneas had been carrying toward his father since the night Troy fell, the physical expression of everything he had survived, and everything his father had been to him, and everything he had not been able to say before Anchises died on the beach, could not be completed. He stood with empty arms and his father's face in front of him. Anchises showed him what needed to be shown. He explained the structure of the afterlife, the philosophy that underpinned why some souls remained and others passed on, the mechanism of purification that the world's tradition said operated on the dead over time, burning away the stains that living had left on them until they were ready for the next life. He showed his son the souls waiting in Elysium for their return to the world above, the souls that would one day be born into Roman bodies and Roman lives and Roman accomplishments, and then he showed him the future, what Aeneas saw in the valley of Elysium. Standing beside his father in the underworld while the Sibyl waited, was the whole of Rome's destiny laid out as a procession of the souls who would make it. Silvius, the son who would be born to Aeneas in Italy, the kings of Alba Longa, Romulus himself, the man who would found the city whose empire would one day encompass the known world, and then the Rome of Virgil's own time, the Rome that the poem was actually about, Augustus, the emperor in whose reign Virgil lived and wrote, the man who had brought peace to Rome after a century of civil war, who was presented in the Aeneid as the fulfillment of the whole story, the destination toward which 7 years of Aeneas's wandering and 30 years of Roman civil conflict had both been travelling. Anchises described him with the language of a man who was giving the ultimate testimony on behalf of the ultimate witness. He described what Rome itself was and what it was for. Other civilizations, he said, would excel at sculpture and oratory and astronomy and philosophy and mathematics, the arts and sciences of peace. Rome's art was different. Rome's art was government. Rome's genius was to rule the world and impose peace on it, and spare the defeated and defeat the proud. These were the Roman arts. These were what the Trojan bloodline running through all these souls had been travelling toward, since the night Aeneas walked out of the burning city, with his father on his shoulders. Aeneas stood in the underworld, looking at the parade of souls that his survival would eventually produce, feeling for the first time since Troy fell the thing that had been missing from all the divine mandates and all the prophetic guidance and all the oracular advice. He felt that it was worth it, not abstractly worth it in the way that large historical forces are sometimes said to justify individual suffering. Worth it in the particular way that seeing the faces of the people you will be responsible for makes the responsibility real rather than conceptual. He was not building a city. He was building a world. Anchises told him a few final practical things, tactical advice about the wars in Italy, and the peoples he would encounter, and the alliances he could make. And then the underworld began to do what the underworld does to living visitors who have overstayed the time available to them, begin to press them gently but firmly back toward the surface. There were 2 gates out of the underworld, the gate of horn, through which true visions passed to the sleeping world above, the gate of ivory, through which false dreams and beautiful illusions went to the sleeping world. Anchises sent his son and the Sibyl out through the gate of ivory. The scholars have been arguing about that detail since the poem was first read. Why the gate of false things? Why not the gate of truth? Some have said it means that everything Aeneas saw in the underworld was illusion. Some have said it means that the living cannot receive truth directly and need the soft coating of the beautiful lie to be able to carry what they have been shown back into the daylight. Some have said it is simply a technical requirement of the underworld's geography and should not be read as a statement about the content of the vision. The poem does not explain. Aeneas came out of the underworld in the grey before dawn at the cave near Cumae, and he walked back down to the ships on the beach, and the fleet sailed north along the Italian coast in the morning light, past Cape Palinurus, where the steersman's bones would one day lie, toward the mouth of the river Tiber, toward the place where everything was going to have to start all over again. Let us rest here in the space between the underworld and Italy, between what has been understood and what has yet to be done, between the dead who have been spoken to and the living who must be dealt with. If you are still awake, if you have been following this story through the underworld and the vision of Rome and the parade of souls and the old man with his arms spread in the green valley of Elysium, then please take a moment and comment below. Tell us which part of tonight's story hit you hardest. Was it Dido in the morning fields? Was it Aeneas reaching for his father 3 times and finding air? Was it the vision of Rome laid out in souls waiting to be born? Type any one of those words below. Dido and Scheiser's room. We will count them and tell you which one dominated. We love knowing what lands. And if you are falling asleep, that is also right. The underworld is the right place to drift off. Sleep now. The fleet is moving up the Italian coast with the first light of a morning that is the beginning of the last chapter of this long story. We will find Italy together. When you are ready, good night. If you are still with us, you have come further tonight than most people realize they are capable of going. You have been in the underworld. You have watched a man reach for his dead father 3 times and find nothing. You have seen the souls of Rome's future lined up in Elysium, waiting to be born, and you have come back out through the gate of ivory into the world of the living, where the fleet is moving up the Italian coast, in the morning light, toward the mouth of the river Tiber, and the wars that the Sibyl promised were waiting there. Before we go into Italy, I need to ask you one more time to leave a comment. We have been tracking where in the world people listen to this channel, and the map we are building in the comments of every video is extraordinary. People from every continent, every time zone, every kind of night and morning and afternoon. But we need more data points, and we need your data point specifically. Drop your location. Drop your state if you are in the United States. Drop the time it is where you are. If you have been listening for the whole journey tonight, type full journey in the comments. If you joined us partway through, tell us where. We read everything and we use this information to understand who we are making this for and how to make it better. Like this video too before you fall asleep. One tap. It changes what this channel can do now. Italy, the mouth of the Tiber River, is not dramatic in the way that coastal features sometimes announce themselves as significant. It is wide and slow, and the water that comes out of it into the Tyrrhenian Sea carries the silt of the Apennine Mountains from a long way inland, and the colour of it in the estuary, where fresh water meets salt, is the colour of the land it has travelled through. But when the Trojan fleet rode up the river's mouth and into the green forest of the Italian riverbank, the quality of the light that reached them through the trees had something in it that the Aeneid describes as recognizable, even to people who had never been here before. They were where they were supposed to be. King Latinus was an old man who had been ruling Latium, the region around the mouth of the Tiber, for longer than anyone could precisely remember. He was not a man of war. He was a man of quiet governance, of the kind of rule that operates through judgment and custom and the maintenance of relationships rather than through force. He had no sons. He had a daughter, Lavinia, who was the inheritor of everything he had built and whose marriage would determine what happened to Latium after he was gone. The oracles had been speaking to Latinus for years about Lavinia's marriage. They had told him, in the way that oracles tell things that are true but not quite interpretable until after the fact, that the man who would marry his daughter would not be Italian. He would come from outside, from far away, and from the marriage would come something that would reach further than either of them could imagine. When the Trojan delegation arrived at his palace with gifts and the message that Aeneas sought an alliance and perhaps a home in Latium, Latinus recognized immediately what the oracle had been pointing at. He received them with the warmth of a man whose long waiting had finally produced the thing he had been waiting for. He sent them back with gifts and promises. He told them Aeneas was welcome. He invited the Trojan leader to come and discuss the terms in person. He also fatally told his daughter. Lavinia had been betrothed informally for years to the local hero Turnus, the king of the Rutulian tribe and the strongest military leader in the region, a young man of exceptional capability and legitimate pride, who had been waiting for the formal announcement of the marriage that everyone around him had been treating as settled for years. He was tall and handsome and brave, and accustomed to being the most impressive person in any room he entered. He was deeply in love with Lavinia in the way that young men who have been told they will have something and who have grown up expecting it are deeply invested in the expectation. Juno saw the situation and acted. She could not prevent Aeneas from reaching Italy. Jupiter had made it clear that preventing the Italian destiny was beyond the scope of what she could do. What she could do was make the cost of achieving it as high as possible. She went to Alecto, one of the Furies, the divine beings who specialized in madness and violence and the particular kind of human behavior that is not ordinary cruelty but something beyond it. The behavior that emerges when something already damaged is pushed past the point of ordinary functioning. Alecto went to the Latin Queen Amata, Lavinia's mother, who had her own entirely rational reasons for preferring Turnus as a son-in-law, and who needed only the smallest divine assistance to transform her preference into something much more consuming. Alecto touched her with a drop of the viper's poison that the Furies carried, and Amata became the instrument of the war that followed. Moving through the Latin women, and through the community's anxiety about foreign men arriving and making claims on their daughters and their land, organizing the opposition to Latinus's welcome of the Trojans before Aeneas had even arrived. Then Alecto went to Turnus. She came to him in a dream, wearing the face of an elderly priestess of Juno, and she told him about the foreign fleet that had arrived at the river's mouth, and the welcome that Latinus had given them, and the threat to everything Turnus had been expecting. She told him to arm. She told him that his future was being given to a stranger. She used the word that people who want to start wars always find for the people they want to go to war against. The word that makes the threat feel immediate, and the response feel necessary, and the violence feel like defense rather than aggression. Turnus woke from the dream and felt what Juno and Alecto had arranged for him to feel, which was righteous fury. The particular kind of anger that comes when you genuinely believe you have been wronged, and when the anger is proportionate to the loss you believe has been threatened. His anger was not false, it was real. It was also being directed by the Queen of the Gods through the instrument of a fury toward the outcome that would hurt Aeneas most on his way to fulfilling the destiny that Juno could not prevent. The incident that actually triggered the open conflict was almost absurdly small, which is consistent with how many great conflicts in human history have actually started. Ascanius, Aeneas's young son, was hunting in the Italian forest near the Trojan camp when he shot an arrow at a stag. The stag happened to be a pet, a tame animal that the local family had raised from a fawn, and that meant a great deal to them. The daughter of the family saw it wounded and went home screaming. Her father and brothers grabbed their tools, and then their weapons, and the neighbours came, and then more neighbours, and what had started as a child's hunting accident became a skirmish that killed several people on both sides before it was stopped. Juno, watching from above, rang the infernal trumpet herself. When she saw that things were not escalating fast enough, the sound that came from the divine trumpet was the sound that the Italian countryside had been dreading and expecting. The sound that told every king and chieftain in Latium that the foreign visitors had finally done what foreign visitors always did, and that the response was going to require everyone. Turnus began calling in the alliances. He was a formidable military organizer, and he had the networks and the reputation to pull together a coalition of Italian tribes that was, on paper, far more powerful than what the Trojans could field. He called on the Rutulians, his own people. He called on the Latins, the people who should have been on Aeneas' side, but who had been turned by Amata's influence and Alecto's madness. He called on the great warrior queen Camilla, who led the Volscian people, and whose military record was exactly the kind of record that makes great warriors make the mistake of believing that excellence in battle translates to invulnerability in battle. And somewhere in Latium, in the forest, and the hills and the communities that had been here long before either the Trojans or the gods' plans for Rome existed, people who did not know they were part of an epic poem armed themselves and came because their king asked them to, and because the foreign ships at the river's mouth were real, and the anger about them was real, even if the fury who had helped amplify it was invisible. Aeneas needed allies. He followed a divine vision, a dream visitation by the river god Tiber himself, who appeared to him on the river's bank at night, and told him where to find the help he needed. He rowed upriver in small boats with a selected group of warriors to find the Arcadian settlement of Pantium, on the hill above the Tiber that would one day be the Palatine Hill, one of Rome's 7 hills, the hill where the emperors would build their palaces. King Evander of Pallantium was exactly the kind of person that the Aeneid needed at this moment in the story. A man of real culture and genuine warmth, who was performing sacrifices to Hercules when Aeneas arrived, and who interrupted the ceremony to welcome the Trojan visitors, because the laws of hospitality were more important to him than the schedule of any ritual. He recognized Aeneas by the description that had travelled ahead of him, the stories of Troy and the wandering and the divine mandate, and he embraced him as something between a political ally and a personal friend that he had been expecting without quite knowing it. The conversation between Aeneas and Evander that evening is one of the Aeneid's most unexpectedly intimate passages. 2 grown men, sitting together on a hillside above the Tiber, talking about the past and the future with the quiet directness of people who understand each other's situation from the inside. Evander told Aeneas about his own history, how he had come to Italy from Greece long before, how this hill had once been wilder and more dangerous, and how the slow work of civilization had made it habitable. He showed Aeneas the hill itself, the future site of Rome, the future capital, and the Tarpeian rock, and the forum, and the temples, and all the structures that would accumulate over centuries on this particular ground. None of them existed yet. It was just a hill with trees on it, and some rough-built structures, and the sounds of a small settlement at night. But Evander named the future anyway, because the oral traditions of his people had been saying for generations that this hill was special. Evander gave Aeneas his most valuable resource, his son Pallas. Pallas was young, approximately the same age as Ascanius, old enough to be in the field, and young enough to be in the period of his life where he was still becoming what he would eventually be. He was brave and intelligent, and his father loved him with the completeness that parents love children, who are everything the parent hoped to produce. Evander sent him with Aeneas's force because he believed in what Aeneas was doing, in the alliance with the Trojans, and the future that the gods had apparently decided was attached to them. He sent his son into a war because he trusted the man he was allying with to bring his son back. The weight of that trust would become very heavy before the war was over. Venus brought Aeneas his divine armour while he rested at Pallantium. Hephaestus had made it as he had made the armour for Achilles when Thetis asked on the night the Myrmidons needed their leader back. The new armour was everything divine craftsmanship could make it. But the piece that Virgil dwells on longest is the shield. The shield that Aeneas received from Venus was decorated, as Achilles' shield had been decorated, with scenes that went beyond the immediate situation. Where Achilles' shield had shown the world as it was, the cities and the farms and the ordinary life of the human community, Aeneas's shield showed the future. Specifically, it showed the future of Rome, Romulus and Remus suckled by the wolf, the rape of the Sabine women, the early wars of the Roman kings, the betrayal of the Gauls by the sacred geese whose honking had warned the capital, the punishment of Catiline by the gods, the eternal reward of the virtuous dead, and in the centre of the shield, given the prominence of the thing the whole history was building toward, Augustus Caesar at the Battle of Actium, the battle where Augustus defeated Mark Antony and Cleopatra and ended the long Roman civil war and became the unchallenged ruler of the Roman world. Aeneas lifted the shield onto his shoulder. He did not know what the images on it meant. He had not yet lived the centuries of history they depicted. But he carried their weight on his shoulder, the way he had carried his father on his shoulder through the burning streets of Troy, not understanding the full meaning of what he was carrying, but carrying it faithfully anyway. He sailed back downriver with his Etruscan allies and his contingent from Pallanteum. The war that followed was the war that the Sibyl had described to him. The war that looked from the outside like a conflict between Trojans and Italians, but that was at its core a conflict between the divine will that had decided what Italy's future would be, and the divine resentment that could not prevent that future, but could exact the maximum possible cost from everyone involved in reaching it. Turnus was a remarkable enemy. This is something the Aeneid insists on even while it is making clear that Turnus is the one who has to lose. He was brave in the way that the best soldiers are brave, not the absence of fear, but the management of it in the direction of effective action. He was a leader who could inspire loyalty through his own example. He was capable of the kind of love that makes a man's courage personal rather than abstract. Because what he was fighting for was not a political objective, but the woman he had expected to marry, and the future he had built his life around expecting. He was also the person Juno had chosen to use, which meant that the divine resentment that could not prevent the founding of Rome was expressing itself through his courage and his love and his legitimate anger, making him the instrument of suffering that was not finally his fault, but that he was going to have to carry forward. The war's early stages went badly for the Trojans, who were outnumbered and far from whatever support they had left in the wider world. Aeneas was away from the camp seeking Etruscan allies when Turnus attacked, and the fighting that followed tested the Trojan force against what Italy had assembled with a thoroughness that left no comfortable margin. Men died. The earth outside the Trojan camp absorbed what battles always ask the earth to absorb. Among the dead were two young men whose story Virgil tells with a care and a grief that suggests he understood exactly what he was doing in placing it in the middle of a war narrative. Nisus and Euryalus, the same two young men who had run the foot race at the funeral games in Sicily, and whose bond had expressed itself in Nisus knocking down a competitor to let his friend win, came forward during the siege with a plan that was born more of the desire to do something than from careful strategic thinking. They would slip through the enemy lines at night and reach Aeneas on his way back from the Etruscan negotiations and bring him news of the camp's situation. A useful mission, a brave one. They asked Pushmish and got it. What went wrong was the way that good intentions and genuine courage sometimes go wrong in conditions that punish everything that is not exactly calculated. Euryalus found a helmet while they were moving through the enemy lines, a beautiful plumed helmet that had belonged to someone important. And he put it on. He should not have put it on. The moonlight caught the plume in the darkness, and the enemy patrol that had been passing nearby saw it and gave chase, and the chase separated the two young men at exactly the wrong moment, and Euryalus was caught. And Nisus came back for him because that was who Nisus was, because he could no more leave Euryalus in danger than he could have left him to lose the foot race. And both of them died before they reached anywhere that mattered. Their heads were put on spears and displayed at the gates of the Latin camp, and when the Trojans inside their fortifications saw them, they grieved in the particular way that people grieve for the young who die before they have had time to become themselves. The grief that contains not only the loss of who they were, but the loss of who they might have been. Euryalus' mother was in the camp. The Aeneid gives her a brief speech that has been quoted and translated and studied for 2,000 years as one of the most compressed expressions of a parent's grief in all of ancient literature. She had been warned when her son went out. She had been told to expect that soldiers go to war, and that war does not give back everyone it takes. She had known all of this, and it had not prepared her for what she saw on those spears outside the camp. She said that she had not brought him with her from Troy to be carried away by the enemy. She said that she wished she had died first. She said that she would have followed him, not waited for him, the soldiers around her, moved by the completeness of what she was expressing, brought her inside and away from the sight. The war continued. Camilla, the warrior queen of the Volscians, was one of the remarkable figures who appeared in the Italian alliance against Aeneas, and whom Virgil treated with the same seriousness that he treated the male warriors. She had been raised as a hunter in the wild from infancy, her father having dedicated her to Diana when her family was in danger, and having trained her to the kind of combat that comes from necessity rather than tradition. She could throw javelins with accuracy that the male warriors around her respected and sometimes feared. She rode into battle in a way that the Aeneid describes, with the particular admiration that writers use for people who are doing something extraordinarily well. Her downfall was the same failure that the Aeneid traces in several of its warriors. A beautiful thing caught her attention at the wrong moment. An Etruscan warrior dressed in spectacular golden armour passed within range of her, and she turned aside from the battle's broader demands to pursue this one prize. She was focused on the gold and the feathers and the brilliance of what she was chasing, rather than on the arrow that came from a different direction entirely. When Camilla fell, the Italian forces that had been holding their position around her felt the battlefield change under them in the way that it changes when something that had been providing structural confidence is suddenly gone. Turnus heard about her death and abandoned the mountain pass where he had been waiting to ambush Aeneas. He came down to the plain. He had made a calculation about where he needed to be that turned out to be wrong, because the information he was working from was wrong, and the army that he had left the ambush position to join had already been defeated by the time he arrived at the field. The two armies, exhausted and diminished and surrounded by the dead of what had been too many engagements in too short a time, came to the understanding that a decisive resolution was required. Latinus attempted to negotiate. He proposed a settlement that would have satisfied what the oracle had told him, and given Aeneas everything the divine mandate required without the further cost in human lives that continuing the war would demand. Turnus's ally Drances, a Latin politician who had his own reasons for opposing Turnus, and who expressed those reasons with the kind of oratorical skill that the Aeneid clearly identifies as something to be viewed with some suspicion, made the case in the Latin assembly for ending the war by giving Aeneas what the oracle had promised him. He directed his argument toward Turnus, with the specific aim of provoking rather than persuading. Turnus's answer to Drances was one of the moments in the poem where his genuine quality as a human being comes through most clearly, which is part of why the Aeneid is a more complex poem than it would be if Aeneas were simply right and Turnus was simply wrong. He said that he would rather fight Aeneas personally, one-on-one, than watch more men die in the grinding collective violence that the war had become. He proposed the single combat. He said that whoever the gods favoured would win, and that the woman whose marriage had started the conflict would go to whichever man the gods decided deserved her. He said it with the honest courage of someone who knows he may lose, and who has decided that the personal loss is preferable to the collective cost of what he is being asked to authorize by continuing the war. The terms were agreed, the armies drew back, the space between them was cleared for the two champions, but Juno was not done. She sent her divine sister Juturna, who was Turnus's sister, and who was a divine being in her own right, a water nymph of considerable power, to break the truce before it could resolve anything. Juturna moved through the Latin forces, wearing the face of a trusted Rutulian warrior, and she spoke to the men who were watching their champion prepare for single combat with the accumulated anxiety of people who love someone who is about to be in danger. A bird omen that Tolumnius the Latin priest misread, or perhaps read correctly but decided to present as he did for his own reasons, provided the trigger. Tolumnius shouted that the gods were on the Latin side. He threw his spear. Someone on the Trojan side died from it. Both sides moved forward with the particular inevitability of crowds in which one action has resolved the tension of waiting into the motion that the tension had been building toward. Aeneas was wounded in the confusion of the renewed battle. An arrow hit him, and he had to be withdrawn from the field. The wound was treated by the divine physician Iapix, who worked with every skill he had and could not get the arrow out until Venus intervened invisibly with a medicinal herb from her divine stores. And the wound healed fast enough that Aeneas was back on the field before the battle had fully resolved. The Latin city fell into something close to panic when word reached its walls that the battle outside was going badly. Amata, whose manipulation by Alecto had started so much of what followed, killed herself when she heard reports, apparently false, that Turnus was dead. She had been at the centre of the forces that had produced the war, and she ended before the war did, in the particular desperation of someone who has been running from one crisis to the next for so long that the emotional reserves that distinguish accurate reports from false ones have been exhausted. The death of the queen was announced inside the Latin walls, and the city's mourning for her added to the weight of everything else that was pressing down on the Italian cause. Turnus, fighting elsewhere on the battlefield, felt the shift in what was happening even before specific news reached him. The landscape of battle has a quality that experienced warriors learn to read, a quality in the sound and the movement of it that communicates the direction things are going, without requiring specific information. He was moving toward the city to help defend it when Juturna appeared to him in her own form, his divine sister, and told him what she had been doing and that she could not help him further. He looked at her and said something that has been read by every student of the Aeneid since it was written as one of the most important lines in the poem. He said that his destiny had overcome him. He told her not to follow him any further. He told her that he was going to face Aeneas. He asked for someone to take him the message back to the Latin forces that he was fighting the single combat they had all agreed to before the truce was broken. Let the battle stop. Let the war end. Let this be between the two men it had always really been between. Aeneas heard the message and stopped. He welcomed the terms. He was aware of the possibility that this was another deception, another manipulation by the divine forces that had been making straight lines difficult throughout the entire Italian campaign. But he had fought the war honestly when he could, and he was willing to fight its conclusion honestly too. The armies drew back for the second time. The space opened up again. Turnus walked out into it. What the two men felt when they faced each other in the cleared space between the armies is not something the Aeneid can fully express, because it was a private thing. The experience of two people who have been moving toward each other as opponents for months, and who are now close enough to see each other's faces. Turnus was larger. His spear, when he lifted it, had the heft of something designed to end things decisively. He threw it. The divine armour that Venus had brought from Hephaestus's forge deflected it the way divine armour deflects what it is made to deflect. Aeneas threw his spear. It hit Turnus's thigh. The wound was not immediately fatal, but it was serious enough to bring Turnus to the ground. Turnus looked up at Aeneas standing above him. He said the things that a man who has lost says when he is facing the final consequence of losing, and when he is trying to say them with the dignity that he still has available to him. He said that he had been beaten, and that the Latins were watching, and that Lavinia was Aeneas's. He asked for mercy. He invoked his father Daunus, who was old and who would be left without a son if Aeneas chose to kill rather than spare. He said that Aeneas had reached as far as he needed to reach. He stopped there and waited. Aeneas stood above him and looked at him, and felt what the Aeneid records as a moment of hesitation, the possibility of mercy, the option of letting this end with the defeated man's life rather than with his death. Turnus had been brave. Turnus had loved his people. Turnus had proposed the single combat specifically to spare further collective suffering. These were not the qualities of a man who deserved no consideration. Then Aeneas saw the sword belt on Turnus's shoulder. It was Pallas's sword belt. The young man who had been sent into the war by his father Evander, because Evander trusted Aeneas. The young man who had died in this war at Turnus's hands, whose death had been reported to his father on the hillside above the Tiber, in the terms that no parent can receive without permanent damage to the part of them that had believed the risk was worth taking. The grief and the love and the responsibility and the war came together in Aeneas in the moment he saw the sword belt, and the mercy that had been forming dissolved into something else, something that the Aeneid calls furor, the divine fire of rage and grief that it has been tracing through the poem since the night Troy fell, and that has never been entirely extinguished in the man who walked out of the burning city. He drove the sword home. The life left Turnus with the particular unwillingness of a life that had been lived fully, and that does not go easily. The shade of him descended to the underworld. The war was over. The Aeneid ends there. It ends in the moment of violence, rather than in the moment of peace that follows it. The founding of the city, the actual building of what will become Rome, the marriage to Lavinia, the blending of the Trojan and Latin peoples that Jupiter had described to Juno as the resolution of everything, all of that happens after the poem ends. We see none of it directly. We are left at the moment of completion and beginning simultaneously, at the point where the long story has arrived at its destination, and the next story, the actual building, is just about to start. The Aeneid does this deliberately. Virgil knew that the poem was about the journey rather than the destination. Everything that Rome became was already present in the story of getting there. The character that would eventually run an empire was already visible in the man who had carried his father through the burning streets and crossed the Mediterranean in ships that Juno kept trying to wreck, and gone down to the underworld and come back up and fought a war he had not wanted against people who had been maneuvered into fighting him. The values that Rome at its best tried to embody, the piety toward the gods, the duty toward family, the loyalty to the future even when the future was obscured, the willingness to sustain what needed to be sustained, regardless of the personal cost. All of it was already in the man who arrived at the mouth of the Tiber with his fleet of battered ships and his handful of survivors and his father's memory and his son's future, and the household gods of Troy carried safe through everything. The Roman Empire that Virgil was writing about, when he wrote the Aeneid, the empire of Augustus Caesar that had emerged from the catastrophe of a century of civil war, was also the empire that would eventually encompass all of the known world and last for 500 years in the west and 1500 years in the east. It would produce Roman law, which became the foundation of the legal systems of most of the modern world. It would spread the Latin language, which became the foundation of French, Spanish, Portuguese, Italian, Romanian, and the academic and scientific vocabulary of English. It would spread the administrative and engineering practices that made it possible to run a continent, the roads and the aqueducts and the organizational structures that Europe would use and adapt for 1,000 years after Rome itself had fallen. All of that was there in the story, present in the seed that Aeneas was planting when he drove the sword into Turnus on the plain of Latium. The cost was visible too. The cost was always visible in the Aeneid, which is what separates it from simple propaganda. Dido died for this, Pallas died for this. The young men Nisus and Euryalus died for this. The unnamed Italian farmers and warriors who had been turned by divine manipulation into enemies of a man they had no personal quarrel with died for this. The poem does not hide the cost. It presents it alongside the outcome with the kind of honesty that makes great literature different from comfortable myth. This is the Aeneid. This is why it has been read for 2,000 years. Not because it tells you that empire is good and that destiny is simple, and that the people who built great things were uncomplicated, and that the people who died for great things died willingly and without loss, but because it tells the truth about what the building of anything significant actually requires, and what it actually costs, and what the people who paid that cost were actually like inside the necessity they were living through. Ist was not a perfect hero. He made choices that caused pain he could not have fully anticipated. He left Dido. He killed Turnus when mercy was possible. He carried the household gods of a civilization that had burned to its foundation across the Mediterranean for 7 years, and built something new from them, something that was genuinely new, not Troy rebuilt, but something that Troy's survival made possible. He was human. He was doing something that was beyond what humans typically do. And the gap between those two things is where the poem lives and where the long fascination with it comes from. Tonight you have walked with him, from the Gate of Ivory and through the Italian wars, and to the moment of the sword and the end of the fighting and the beginning of everything that came after. You have been in the story that the Emperor Augustus used to explain where his world came from, and what gave it the right to call itself the heir of something divine. You have been in the 3,000-year conversation about what it costs to build a civilization, and whether the cost is ever fully justified, and whether the people who pay it chose to or simply found themselves in it. These are not questions with clean answers. They have not had clean answers for 3,000 years. The poem does not supply them. It asks them more clearly than almost any other text in the tradition, and leaves them for you to hold. Please leave a comment before you sleep. Tell us where you are. Tell us whether you think Aeneas made the right choice at the end. Type mercy or justice below. We are genuinely interested in what this story's readers and listeners feel about its most complicated moment, and we read every comment that anyone leaves. Your answer matters to us, and it matters to the community that is building in the comment section of this channel. The community of people who come here at night to hear long stories in calm voices about the things that have always been true about being human. Skupskers, if you have not already. Our journey through the Greek and Roman epic tradition is not finished. There are more stories to tell, and each one is connected to the ones before it. And together they make a picture of what the ancient world believed and feared and hoped for and tried to build. And that picture is worth spending time with, like this video, before you sleep. And now, sleep. You have been in a burning city and on a storm-tossed sea and in the underworld and on a battlefield in ancient Italy. You have heard the voice of a dead man's shade speaking to his son in a green valley. You have watched a man who could have shown mercy choose something else instead. You have been inside the story that Rome told itself about where it came from. Let all of it settle now into the deep quiet of wherever you are. Let the ancient world recede to the distance that dreams put between you and the things you have been thinking about. Let the darkness around you be kind and full of nothing more urgent than sleep. The household gods of Troy are safe. They travelled a long way to find the place they were carried to. They are resting now. Everything that needed to arrive has arrived. You can rest too. Good night. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening to the whole story. Thank you for making this channel worth making. The next story is already waiting, but tonight is for sleep good night. There is more to tell about the years of wandering before Italy, more texture to the journey that brought Aeneas from the burning gates of Troy to the mouth of the Tiber. And tonight we are going to slow down and walk through some of what we moved past more quickly before. Because the middle of the Aeneid, the years of sailing and stopping and trying and failing and trying again, is where the poem does some of its most interesting work, and it deserves more time than a summary can give it. Let us go back to the beginning of the wandering. Not to Troy itself, but to the immediate aftermath of Troy, the period when Aeneas and the survivors he had gathered from the ruins of the city were still on the Trojan coast, still close enough to the hill where the city had been that they could smell the smoke of it on certain days, depending on the direction of the wind. The process of building the ships had taken what it always takes, which is more time than you expect, and the particular kind of sustained effort that grief makes difficult. The Trojan survivors were not a large group. They were not the army that had defended the city. That army was dead on the plain, or dead inside the walls on the last night, or scattered across the Greek ships as slaves. What remained was the people who had found their way to Aeneas in the chaos, the women and the old men, and the men who had been on the wrong part of the wall when the Greek force poured through the gates, and who had survived by accident more than by any plan, and the small number of warriors who had gathered around their prince in the mountains above the ruins, and who had decided, for reasons that included calculation and loyalty and desperation in different proportions depending on the person, to follow wherever he led. They cut timber from the forests of the mountain slopes above what had been Troy. They shaped it with axes and adzes and the particular knowledge of the kind of men who had been sailors and who understood the relationship between tree and water. They built ships, not the grand military vessels that had once filled Troy's harbour, but practical craft designed to carry people and their possessions across water without capsizing, and they launched them in the harbour of what had been the greatest trading city in the region, and was now a collection of smouldering ruins. The departing view of the shore where Troy had been is one of the moments the Aeneid treats with a kind of compressed grief. Aeneas looked back. He saw the plain where the fighting had happened for 10 years. He saw the outline of what had been the walls. He saw the harbour and the beach. He was looking at the ground where people he had grown up with and fought with and loved had died, and he was sailing away from it. And the smoke that still rose from the ruined city was visible for a long time as the fleet moved south. The first landfall at Thrace was the first test of whether the divine mandate they were following was as real as it seemed, or as real as the story they were telling themselves about the burning city that had produced it. The coast of Thrace, north of the Aegean, was familiar to Trojan merchants who had traded there before the war. It was not hostile territory in any obvious sense. The local ruler had a relationship with Troy that suggested he would be sympathetic to Trojan survivors. They landed, and they began to do what displaced people do when they land somewhere with good soil and fresh water. They began to think about whether this might be the place. The altar that Aeneas began to build for the first sacrifices on this new ground was where the first warning came. He pulled at a myrtle bush to gather branches for the altar decoration, and the root he pulled came up with blood. He pulled more branches, and more blood came, and from the ground where the blood was coming, a voice rose that identified itself. Polydorus, a young Trojan prince, the son of Priam, who had been sent to Thrace in the early years of the war, with a significant amount of gold, the kind of hedging against catastrophic loss that prudent parents make when they see the shape of what might be coming. He had been killed by the Thracian king when it became clear that Troy was going to lose, because gold is always worth more than the loyalty of the party that is no longer in a position to threaten consequences for disloyalty. His body had been buried without ceremony, and the spears that had killed him had taken root in the soil over his grave and grown into the myrtle whose roots Aeneas had pulled. The ground was polluted. The place was wrong. They gave Polydorus the proper funeral rites that had been denied him, and they left. The island of Delos was the next significant stop, and it was there that the divine consultation that would define the first phase of the wandering happened. Aeneas went to the temple of Apollo on the island where the god had been born, the island that was itself a divine location, and he asked for the guidance that the voyage needed. Apollo spoke through the oracle in the way that the god always spoke, in language that was accurate but not immediately interpretable, in words that pointed at a truth without naming it directly. "Sake your ancient mother," the oracle said. "The land where the first of your race was born. That is where Aeneas's descendants would rule, and where the kingdom would reach from generation to generation further than the eye could follow." The ancient mother, Anchises, who was the scholar of the family's genealogy, interpreted this immediately. Crete, the island from which one of the Trojan ancestors had originally come, the old tradition said. Crete was the ancient mother of the Trojan line. They should go to Crete. They went to Crete. They chose the site for their city. They began to build. The Aeneid names the settlement Pergamum, carrying the name of Troy's citadel into the new foundation, the way settlers have always carried the names of what they left into the names of what they build. The settlers organized the land among themselves with the particular efficiency that comes from people who have been living without organized space for long enough to feel the relief of having it again. They began to plant. The plague came before the crops could, not a divine plague in the precise targeted way that Apollo's plague had come against the Greek camp at Troy. A general sickness, the kind that develops when too many people are crowded into conditions that do not yet have the infrastructure to support them. The kind that moves through a settlement and takes the weakest first and then expands its range as it becomes established. Animals died first, which is always the warning that experienced survivors recognize. Then people began to fall sick. The crops that had been planted failed in the fields. The settlement that had been beginning to feel possible revealed itself as something that was not yet sustainable. The household gods appeared to Aeneas in a dream at the depth of this crisis. The carved figures of divine protection that Anchises had carried from Troy, and that Aeneas had been carrying ever since. They appeared with the authority of beings who understood the full context of what was happening, and they said what they had been waiting for the situation to make necessary to say. They told him Crete was wrong. Crete was not the ancient mother. The ancient mother was Hesperia, Italy, the western land. Dardanus, the ancestor of the Trojan line, had come not from Crete but from Italy, from Etruria, from the western shore. The oracle had been pointing west, not south. They had gone the wrong direction. The voyage resumed. Between Crete and the Italian coast lay the open sea and several significant obstacles, among them the Strophiades, the turning islands where the Harpies lived, and where the Trojans' attempt to resupply with fresh meat ended badly. The Harpies were creatures that the ancient mythological tradition had associated with divine punishment, since long before Virgil wrote the Aeneid, beings that combined the speed and reach of birds with the malice of beings who have been assigned a function they have come to enjoy. They came in response to the cattle slaughter the Trojans conducted on the island, swooping down on the feast with the screaming that was their characteristic sound, fouling everything with the touch of their taloned feet, making the meal impossible to eat. The Trojans drew their swords. Aeneas shouted the order, and the warriors attacked the Harpies, with the intensity of men who have been hungry and who have finally had food in reach and whose food has just been spoiled. The harpies were not physically harmed. They flew above the reach of the swords, and they regrouped on a peak above the beach, and their leader Celaeno delivered her pronouncement from the safety of the height she had retreated to. She told them they would reach Italy. The mockery in her voice, as she said, it was the kind of mockery that comes from someone who is telling a truth and knows that the full truth is more complicated than the part they are saying. She told them they would be so hungry by the time they arrived that they would eat their tables. And then she flew away, and the harpies went with her, and the Trojans were left on a beach, surrounded by food they could not safely eat, listening to the sound of wings fading. Aeneas ordered the anchors weighed immediately. Whatever the island had to offer was no longer worth having. They sailed. The coast of Epirus was where they found the strangest and most heartbreaking monument to what the Trojan War had done to the people who survived it. They put in at a harbour on the Greek mainland's northwestern edge, and they heard sounds from somewhere above the harbour that made experienced Trojans stop and listen in the specific way of people who are hearing something they recognise but cannot place. The sounds were the sounds of Trojan ritual, the particular cadences of Trojan religious ceremony, performed in the old language with the old words, in a place that was not Troy, and that was not Italian, and that was not any of the stopping points on the route they had been following. They followed the sounds up from the harbour, and they found a small replica of Troy, a miniature version of the lost city built from the materials available on the Epirote coast, with a gate modelled on the Scaean Gate, and a stream they had called the Simois, after the river that had run below Troy's walls. Andromache was performing funeral rites at a cenotaph she had built for Hector. A cenotaph is an empty tomb, a monument for the dead who have no retrievable body. And the cenotaph she had built for her husband was this small Troy's centre, the point around which the whole settlement had been organised. She had built a city around her grief. She had made her mourning into architecture. When she looked up and saw Aeneas, the shock of it took away her ability to function in the ordinary way for a moment. She went white. She stepped back. She asked whether he was real or whether she was seeing a shade. She had been talking to shades for years in this settlement. She had been performing rites for the dead since Troy fell. The possibility that this was another visitation of the kind she had been hosting at Hector's empty tomb was not impossible from where she stood. He assured her he was real. He asked where Helenus was. He asked how she had come to this place. The story she told him was the story of what had happened to Hector's widow in the aftermath of Troy's fall. She had gone to Neoptolemus, Achilles' son, as his prize from the war. She had lived in his household as what the ancient world called a captive woman, which is a more comfortable description than the reality it names. When Neoptolemus died, killed in a quarrel at Delphi, she had come to Helenus, the Trojan seer who had ended up in Epirus through the same kind of complicated war aftermath redistribution that had scattered everyone. And Helenus had become the ruler of this part of Epirus, and she had become his wife. It was a survival story, not a triumph and not a defeat, just the continued presence of two people who had both loved Hector in their different ways, making the best of what the war had left them in a small settlement on the coast of a country that was not theirs, surrounding themselves with the shapes and sounds of the world that the war had taken. Helenus appeared. He received Aeneas and the Trojan fleet with the warmth of a man who had not expected this visit and who was made profoundly happy by it in a way that went beyond ordinary hospitality into something more personal, the reunion of people who thought they had lost each other. He sacrificed properly to the gods. He arranged the feast that the occasion required. He gave the fleet supplies and gifts with the generosity of a ruler who was wealthy enough in this small Epirote kingdom to afford to be generous, and then he sat with Aeneas and told him what he knew about the road ahead. Helenus was a prophet, the most gifted seer among the Trojans who had survived the war, and what he told Aeneas that evening drew on everything that prophecy and direct divine communication had given him access to over the years he had spent in Epirus, trying to understand the wider pattern of what had happened to his people and what was going to happen next. He told Aeneas to stay away from the eastern coast of Sicily, because Scylla and Charybdis were both accessible from the eastern strait, and the combination of the monster on the cliff and the whirlpool in the water would destroy the fleet if they tried to push through it. He told him to go around Sicily on the western side, which was longer but survivable. He told him to find the Cumaean Sibyl when he reached the Italian coast, and to ask her everything, because she had access to information that no mortal prophet could match. He told him about Juno. He told him that the Queen of the Gods was going to oppose him in Italy, as she had opposed him everywhere else, that her opposition was not going to stop, and was not going to be satisfied by any offering that any Trojan could make, and that the only appropriate response to her sustained hostility was constant prayer, constant attention to what she might want, and the patient acceptance that some divine anger operates on a timescale that outlasts human understanding. Pray to her, he said, not because it would stop the anger, but because not praying would give her additional justification for continuing it. The ships that Andromache and Helenus gave the Trojan fleet when it departed from this small Epirote Troy were equipped with everything a Trojan crew would need for the months of sailing ahead: gold and ivory and silver mixing bowls, weapons and cloth, and for Ascanius, from Andromache personally, a Trojan embroidered cloak that she had woven herself, the work of her own hands during the years of mourning. She gave it to the boy, and she said the words that the Aeneid records with the care reserved for words that contain more than their surface meaning. She told him to carry her in this gift. She told him the cloak would remind him that she had not forgotten him. She said that Astyanax, Hector's son who had been killed on the night Troy fell, would have been exactly this age. She was giving the cloak to the boy who lived, instead of the boy who had not. She was doing the thing that grief sometimes asks of the grieving, which is to love what remains, because what was lost can no longer be loved in the way that love requires. The fleet sailed from Epirus into the open Adriatic. They followed the Italian coastline south, from above the heel of the boot, keeping the land of the Italians visible on their left, and working their way toward the southern tip that they would have to round to begin the longer circuit of Sicily's western coast that Helenus had recommended. Near the toe of Italy, they stopped at a settlement of Trojans that they had not known existed, people who had made their way to this part of the Italian coast in the years since Troy fell, and who had built a life here, not waiting for the divine mandate that Aeneas was following, but simply settling where they could. The leader of this group warned them away from the strait between the toe of Italy and Sicily, confirming everything Helenus had told them about Scylla and Charybdis, and they continued south to round the toe and begin the western journey. They could hear Charybdis from the sea. The sound of it reached them before they could see anything, a roaring that had no equivalent in the sounds of ordinary water. The sound of an enormous quantity of water being pulled in one direction with a force that was not the force of current or wind, but something older and more fundamental. They pulled hard at the oars to keep the fleet from being drawn closer to the source of that sound. Men who were experienced in the Aegean and had navigated currents and narrow straits all their sailing lives pulled at the oars with the particular intensity of people who understand from the sound alone that the margin for error here is not margin at all, but the presence or absence of the existence of the fleet. They made it past. Sicily came up on the left side. Its western coast was longer than the eastern route would have been, but it was navigable, and it was safe, and the Trojans worked along it, with the steady discipline of people who have had enough close calls with divine interference to treat routine sailing as a gift worth being careful with. On the slope of Etna they saw, on the shore, a figure that none of them had been expecting to see. A man who was not entirely intact, filthy and reduced by weeks of living on whatever the volcanic landscape provided, who came running toward the surf when he saw the fleet passing, and who shouted for them to take him aboard in the particular desperate way of someone who has been alone for too long. His name was Aeneid. He was Greek. He had been with Odysseus on the voyage that had stopped on this same Sicilian coast, and he had been left behind when Odysseus fled the Cyclops' cave. He had been living in the landscape of Etna since then, hiding from the Cyclopes, who had been searching for the men who had blinded Polyphemus. He was terrified and thin, and entirely willing to accept help from Trojans, who were technically enemies of his people in the war that had ended the previous phase of the ancient world. Aeneas took him aboard. This small act of generosity toward an enemy is one of the details in the Aeneid that Virgil uses to establish something important about the character of the civilization that was being built. The Trojans took aboard a Greek survivor and asked him questions and treated him as a human being in distress rather than as the descendant of people who had burned their city. The boundaries of who deserved help were not drawn at the edges of Trojan loyalty. Achaemenides told them about the Cyclopes, and about the cave, and about Odysseus, and about what the men inside the wooden horse had felt when they heard the Trojans celebrating outside and knew what was going to happen, and had to stay still and silent in the dark and wait. This was information that the Trojans received with the complex quality of people hearing accounts of their own destruction from someone who had been part of producing it, and who was now asking them for help. They absorbed it without acting on it. They moved past the slopes of Etna, where the rumbling of the volcano and the crashes that were audible, even from the fleet's distance, spoke of something enormous going on beneath the rock. And the Trojans who were familiar with what the ancient traditions said was happening, below those slopes felt something that the epic names as awe, the specific awareness of forces operating in the world that are simply too large for the human scale to fully comprehend. They moved north along Sicily's eastern coast, and they came to Astis's settlement, and they rested there, and Anchises died. The death of Anchises happens in the poem between the Sicilian landfall and the storm, and it happens in the particular way that the deaths of the people we have been carrying and protecting sometimes happen, without announcement and without the dramatic framing that would make it easier to process. He had been carried on his son's shoulders through the burning city. He had been carried on his son's decisions through 2 years of wandering from one failed settlement to another. He had been the person whose presence gave the journey its human centre, the old man who remembered Troy and who could say what Troy had been, and who carried the household gods and the genealogy and the accumulated wisdom of a life that had been lived in full before it was uprooted. And then he was gone. Aeneas buried him on the Sicilian shore with everything the ceremony required, and then the fleet sailed for what they believed was Italy, and Juno sent her storm, and Dido's harbour received them. And everything that followed from that reception followed. But now, in part 4 of our journey through the Aeneid tonight, let us sit with something that the poem does not do explicitly, but that rewards explicit attention, which is the nature of what Aeneas was building in Italy, and what it meant to the people who were being asked to build it alongside him. The Trojan settlement in Italy, which would eventually become first Lavinium, and then Alba Longa and eventually Rome, was from the beginning something genuinely new, rather than simply a relocation of what had existed in Troy. The Trojans who arrived at the mouth of the Tiber were not trying to rebuild the city they had lost. They were building something that would justify the losing of it. The distinction matters because it changes what the effort requires. Rebuilding what was lost is grief work, the attempt to reassemble what has been broken. Building something new in the knowledge that what was lost cannot be recovered is a different kind of work, harder in some ways and more possible in others. The Italian landscape that Aeneas found himself in was not empty. It was full of people who had been there for generations, who had their own gods and their own stories about where they came from and what they deserved, who had built their communities and their alliances and their feuds into a pattern that the arrival of the Trojans disrupted without the Trojans initially understanding how deep the disruption went. Latinus ruled Latium from his city of Laurentum. He was a man of genuine piety, someone who took the oracles seriously in the way that careful and thoughtful people take oracles seriously, not as commands that override all judgment, but as information that deserves to be weighed alongside everything else. The oracle had told him his daughter would marry a foreign man. He had been sitting with that information for years, waiting for the foreign man to appear. Turnus, the king of the Rutulians, had not appeared from outside. He was local. He was part of the Italian world that Latinus had known all his life. His claim on Lavinia was not the claim that the oracle had described. Latinus had known this, in the way that honest people know things that are inconvenient, and he had been waiting for the situation to clarify itself. When the Trojan embassy arrived with gifts and the message that their leader sought alliance and land and a possible marriage, Latinus recognized the clarification. He was moved by it in the way that people are moved when a long uncertainty resolves into something that, however complicated, is at least definite. The Latin people who would eventually become the dominant partner in what Rome called its founding were not a single unified people in the way that the later Roman tradition sometimes presented them. They were a collection of communities in the river valley region around the Tiber, each with its own particular history and its own relationships with the communities around them, brought into something like cohesion by geography and the shared experience of living in the same river basin for generations. The Rutulians, Turnus's people, were one of these communities. They were settled to the south of the Latin centre, and their relationship with the Latin tribes was the relationship of neighbours who have a long history of being sometimes allied and sometimes competing. Turnus's position as the most powerful military figure in the region, and his expected marriage to the daughter of Latium's king, would have given the Rutulians a political advantage in the river valley that the other communities would have noted with mixed feelings. The arrival of the Trojans disrupted this balance before any formal alliance with Aeneas was concluded, simply by existing and by being welcomed by Latinus. The communities that had been calculating their own positions relative to the expected Turnus-Lavinia marriage now had to recalculate relative to an entirely new variable, and recalculation in the ancient world was not simply a political exercise, but a social and religious one that touched every relationship in the community simultaneously. Among the Italian peoples who would eventually fight in the alliance against Aeneas, the most remarkable was Mezentius, the Etruscan ruler who had been exiled from his own people for tyranny, and who had found refuge with Turnus. His son Lausus was with him, and the relationship between the two of them, the tyrant father and the good son who stayed loyal to him despite everything, is one of the Aeneid's most precisely observed relationships. Lausus fought in the war against Aeneas, not because he believed in his father's cause in any ideological sense, but because his father was his father, and because the kind of love that keeps a good son attached to a bad father is real even when it cannot be fully justified. He died in the war, intervening to protect Mezentius from Aeneas when Mezentius was wounded, throwing himself between his father and the sword that was coming. And the Aeneid's description of his death and of Aeneas's reaction to killing him is one of the poem's most unexpectedly emotional moments. Aeneas wept when he killed Lausus. He wept over the body of the young man who had come between him and the enemy he had been pursuing. And he said something to the dead Lausus that the ancient tradition understood as a profound statement about the nature of war and the nature of what it means to be the instrument of someone else's grief. He told Lausus that what he had done was praiseworthy. He said it with genuine recognition, not as comfort or as policy, but as the honest judgment of one warrior on another. He returned the body to the Italian soldiers who had been fighting alongside Lausus, with the instruction that they take it to his father with all dignity. He was right to do this, not because it changed anything about the military situation, which it did not, but because the poem is making a point about what kind of civilization Rome was supposed to be, and one of the things it was supposed to be was capable of honouring courage in enemies and returning bodies with respect. These were not incidental virtues. They were the virtues that distinguished a civilization that was worth being built from one that was merely powerful. Mezentius heard about his son's death and came out of the refuge he had retreated to when his wound forced him to withdraw from the battle. And he came out not to fight but to die. He said as much when he confronted Aeneas. He said that without Lausus there was no reason to survive. He fought anyway with everything he had, and when Aeneas's spear took him, he received it the way a man receives something he has been moving toward. He told his horse to take his own message to the people who were waiting for news of him. He died. The war in Italy had its own Achilles in a figure named Turnus, who was everything Achilles was in terms of martial capability and divine favour, and the particular pride that makes great warriors simultaneously magnificent and destructive. And it had its own Patroclus in a figure named Pallas, whose death would unlock the final fury of the war. As Patroclus's death had unlocked the final fury of the Trojan War, Pallas was not Patroclus in every respect. His relationship with Aeneas was not the decades-long intimacy of two young men who had grown up together and between whom everything had been said long ago. He was new to Aeneas, the son of the ally who had trusted Aeneas enough to send his most valuable thing into the conflict. But in the dynamic of the war's emotional arc, Pallas served the same function. He was the young man whose loss would convert the leader's grief into the specific focused fury that ended everything. Turnus killed Pallas. He killed him in single combat after a scene that the Aeneid records with the particular care of someone who wants the reader to understand that what was happening was more than an incident in a battle. Pallas was not Turnus's equal. He was brave, and he was young, and he had the qualities that would have made him something significant if the war had given him the time to become it. Turnus was older and more experienced, and he was the best warrior in Italy, in the way that Achilles had been the best warrior in Greece. But there was also divine favour on Turnus's side in that moment. The sustained support of Juno, who was not done extracting the price she had decided the founding of Rome would cost. And Pallas died with a courage that the poem records fully, while also making clear that the outcome was never really in doubt. Turnus stripped the sword belt from the body. This was the act that would eventually kill him. Though neither he nor anyone watching could know that yet, he wore it on his own shoulder, the way victors wore the tokens of those they had defeated. And it would still be there at the end of the poem when Aeneas saw it, and the grief and the love and the responsibility collapsed together into the fury that made mercy impossible. Aeneas heard about Pallas's death on the battlefield, and what the Aeneid records of his reaction is different from what it recorded of his reaction when he heard about Creusa, or about Palinurus, or about any of the other losses the voyage had required. This was the reaction of someone who understood the precise weight of what this loss meant for the man who had trusted him. Evander had sent his son. Evander had trusted that Aeneas would keep what he was given. He had not kept it. The knowledge of what Evander would feel when the news reached him was part of what Aeneas carried from the moment he heard about Pallas. It did not make him less effective as a military leader. If anything, it made him more effective in the particular way that grief focused rather than scattered. gives a person a precision of purpose that ordinary motivation cannot match. But it was there, and it was real. And it would be there at the end when the sword belt was visible on Turnus's shoulder. The final battle approached like everything in the Aeneid approached. Through layers of delay and intervention, and the accumulated weight of everything that had led to it, each individual cause building on the previous ones, until the moment when all of them arrived simultaneously, and the outcome was inevitable. Jupiter called the divine assembly. He had been allowing the war to develop according to the dynamics that Juno and the other interested parties had put in motion, but he had limits to what he was willing to allow to continue, and those limits had been reached. He told the gods directly that no further divine intervention on either side of the Italian war would be permitted. The outcome would be determined by what the humans involved in it were capable of. No more assistance. No more hindrance. Let them do what they were going to do. Juno responded with the particular anger of someone who has been told that the game they have been playing is over, but who cannot yet accept that the rules they have been working around are now being enforced rather than gently observed. She asked for one concession, not a military advantage, but a smaller thing. She asked that, when it was over, when the Trojan destiny had been fulfilled and the Italian people had been joined to the Trojan line, the combined people would not be called Trojans, they would be Latin. The Latin language would survive, the Latin customs would survive. Troy's name would be absorbed into something larger and something new. Jupiter gave her this. It was not a small concession. It was, in a sense, the concession that the whole poem had been negotiating toward. Rome would not be a Trojan colony. It would be something that contained the Trojan element without being defined by it. Something that the Trojan contribution made possible, but that was larger than its origins. The Latin future that Juno was asking for was the Roman future that the poem was written to celebrate, and the divine negotiation that concluded in Jupiter granting her request was the mythological explanation for why Rome was Roman, rather than simply Trojan transplanted to the Italian shore. The single combat between Aeneas and Turnus happened on the plain below the Latin city in the presence of both armies. The ground was marked out, the terms were stated, the gods were invoked. The warriors faced each other across the cleared space, with everything that had been built toward this moment, on both sides of them and above them. What the combat required from Aeneas was not simply military excellence, though it required that. It required the kind of presence that 7 years of wandering and surviving and leading and losing had built in him. The capacity to be fully in the moment of the most critical thing, while also carrying everything else that had led to it. He was fighting for the household gods, and for Ascanius, and for the divine mandate, and for the deaths of Patroclus' palace, and for the Italian future that the underworld had shown him, and for the memory of his father's face in the green valley of Elysium. Turnus was fighting for Lavinia and for his people, and for the legitimate anger of someone whose future had been redirected by forces he did not choose and could not control. His anger was real. His love was real. His courage was real. He deserved better than the sequence of divine manipulations that had brought him to this field. The outcome was what the oracle and the divine assembly and the weight of the poem's momentum had been pointing at. Aeneas won. Turnus fell. Aeneas saw the sword belt. The mercy that might have been present became impossible. And the Aeneid ended. Let us sit here now in the silence after the poem's final word, in the particular silence that great literature produces when it has said everything it needed to say and refuses to say more than it needs to. The silence is not empty. It is full of everything the poem has been holding and has now released. Dido and Pallas and Nisus and Euryalus and Creusa and Anchises and Palinurus and everyone else who died on the way to the outcome that the divine will had decided. Full of the Italy that would grow from the settlement on the Tiber into something that would shape the world for 1,000 years after Virgil put down his reed pen. Virgil himself died before he could finish revising the Aeneid. He had been working on it for 11 years when he fell ill during a journey to Greece. A journey he had made, partly because he wanted to spend 3 more years in Greece refining the poem, before he was satisfied with it. He died in Brundisium, in the heel of the Italian boot, in the year 19 BCE. He had reportedly asked his friends to burn the manuscript because it was not finished. His friends did not burn it. Augustus had the poem published. What we have is the version Virgil had not yet revised to his satisfaction. What we have is one of the greatest works of literature ever produced in any language by anyone, in its not quite finished state. This matters for the same reason that knowing Aeneas was human matters. The Aeneid, like the civilization it was written to celebrate, and like the man it was written about, is not perfect. It is finished enough to be extraordinary, and it carries within it the evidence of something still in progress, still reaching toward what it wanted to be. This is what the poem is ultimately about. Not achievement, not the completed and final thing. The reaching. Aeneas reached toward his father in the underworld and found air. He reached toward Italy through 7 years of storms and failures and losses and kept going. He built something from the ashes of something that had been consumed, and what he built became one of the most significant civilizations in human history. And the reaching that built it was the same reaching that left his arms empty in Elysium. The household gods are safe. They are in Italy. Everything the poem promised has been promised. Everything the poem required has been paid. You have been with this story through the burning city, and the Mediterranean wandering, and the storm, and Carthage, and the underworld, and the Italian wars, and the single combat on the plain. You have been with it for hours in the dark, in the warmth of wherever you are in the world tonight, in whatever your particular corner of the 21st century sounds and smells like. Please, before you sleep, comment below. Tell us where you are. Tell us what you are going to do differently tomorrow because of something this story touched. Tell us mercy or justice. Tell us Aeneas or Dido. Tell us which part of this long journey through the ancient world you want to hear next. We are listening. We are reading. We are here. Scoo if you are not already subscribed. Like this video. Share it with anyone who needs a long, quiet night in the company of something that has been true for a very long time. And now sleep. You have been a remarkable companion through one of the most demanding and most rewarding journeys in all of ancient literature. You have earned the rest that comes after having been somewhere real. The household gods are safe. The fleet is at rest. The Tiber flows quietly past the hill where Rome will be. Everything that was supposed to arrive has arrived. Good night.